by a certain creek in the mountain. The prince stood on a rock, gazing at the young lady in green before him and inquired, "You've knitted the 7th aperture of the Gossamer Steps technique?" She was Mahi in Gale, cousin of Ravina in Gale. In terms of beauty, she stood shoulder to shoulder with Ravina. Unlike Ravina, who had a slim and shiny body, Mahi was more of a curvy type. She had extra fat in certain areas, making her look juicier. Mahi nodded, her shapely brows knitting together slightly as she responded, "But it's getting harder and harder to sense them the more yarns I knit. I've already spent an entire day trying, but I've yet to sense the 8th yarn." She suspiciously looked at Ezra Zephyr and asked, "So how will you help me, sir?" She was a lot sweet in chatter compared to her cousin. Besides her, stood Ravina. She gazed at Ezra as well. "Sit down," the werewolf prince pointed to a rock. Mahi sat down with her back straight. Her green tight clothes wrapped around her full curves that extended all the way to her waist as her chest stealthily rose and fell. Ezra Zephyr also sat down in front of her. "Stretch out your hands." Ravina glared at Ezra Zephyr, her eyes a little cold. Ezra Zephyr sighed. "Can you just go somewhere else?" Ravina snorted softly as she glared daggers at Ezra. "If I find out that you're trying to take advantage of her, I will not let you off." "Another threat that I don't give a shit about." "Hee hee," Mahi chuckled. After finishing, she extended her hands, palms facing Ezra Zephyr. The corners of Ezra's lips curled slightly downwards as he also extended his hands, placing them against Mahi and Gale's. A slight cooling sensation spread from their touching palms, causing Mahi's heart to tremble a little. Although she was looking at Ezra gravely, a blush had risen on her face. The prince closed his eyes and said, "Circulate the Gossamer Steps technique." Only upon seeing that Ezra Zephyr was seemingly not trying anything funny, did Ravina give her cousin an eye signal and she forcibly attempted to ignore the uncomfortable feeling from her palms. She shut her eyes, willing herself into calmness, before beginning to direct her spiritual energy along the Gossamer Steps training route. Spiritual energy began to flow, circulating round after round. Mahi also began to sense the location of the 8th yarn. Ezra Zephyr found something. He could easily tell the path of the rest of the yarns. The only change is first yarn. If one can find the first yarn, the remaining path would be the same. However, not all are as talented as Ezra Zephyr to find the path so soon. Water flowed in the creek, while two figures sat facing each other. The atmosphere was rather peaceful. 15 minutes stealthily passed as Mahi gradually became somewhat disappointed. She was still unable to find the 8th yarn to knit. After some hesitation, she decided to leave her prowess state. It was at this moment, however, that Ezra Zephyr's voice was transmitted into her ears. "Don't be distracted and do not resist. I will soon begin guiding your spiritual energy." Mahi flinched, somewhat hesitant. Allowing someone else to guide one's spiritual energy was extremely dangerous. If the other party had any ill intentions, he could cause havoc with the spiritual energy, a situation which may even result in one's channels being damaged. Ezra seemed to know what was on Mahi's mind and hence, did not rush her, but instead patiently waited for her answer. After all, there was nothing he could do without her cooperation. He could understand Mahi's hesitation. If he was in her place, he too would not easily allow someone else to direct the flow of spiritual energy in his body. This silence lasted for a few dozen seconds before Ravina spoke. "Let him do that, I am here, he won't be able to do anything funny." Hearing that, Mahi replied, "Okay sis." The prince suddenly felt the spiritual energy in Mahi's body slow down, as if control had been withdrawn. "Ezra, let's see whether you're a liar or someone who truly has the ability." Ravina's calm voice sounded. She was a decisive person. Since she had already chosen to place her faith in Ezra Zephyr, there was naturally no reason to hesitate anymore. However, if he was lying to her, she would let him know what kind of price there was to pay. The prince secretly admired Ravina's decisiveness. Without further ado, he began to direct the spiritual energy in her body. Energy flowed along her channels, suddenly speeding up a split second later as it prepared to charge towards a certain point in her body. Ravina's body tensed up at this moment, her heart beating rapidly. Saa. A faint sound was heard. Next, a stunned Mahi felt a yarn being forcefully knitted in a certain part of her body. The moment this yarn was knitted, the previous 7 yarns she had knitted began to vibrate in resonance. This response, she mumbles. The answer was already clear, she had knitted the 8th yarn. Ezra had actually succeeded? Ravina's heart was filled with shock. To think that what her cousin had been unable to accomplish with an entire day of hard work had been completed by Ezra so quickly. How had he done it? Mahi and Gale was so astonished that she even forgot to begin the next step of polishing the yarn. You'll have to polish the yarn yourself, I won't be able to help you in this segment. Only when Ezra's voice sounded in her ears did Mahi return to her senses. She hurriedly began circulating her spiritual energy, sending wisp after wisp into the yarn to polish it. Ezra withdrew his hands, secretly breathing a sigh of relief as he watched spiritual energy rise around Mahi and Gale. It was fortunate that he had succeeded, or it would not have ended well for him, given Mahi and Ravina's background. 50 spirit jade pieces. Looks like I can continue to purchase wind essence. Mahi was finally done 2 hours later, the 8th yarn in her body fully polished, before being infused with wind essence, allowing her to take another step forward towards the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. Her long eyelashes trembled faintly as she slowly opened her eyes. Ezra Zephyr stood on a rock to her front and was currently looking at her. How is it? You should believe that I'm not a liar now, right? Ezra smiled. Mahi blushed slightly, a somewhat complicated expression in her eyes as she looked towards Ezra Zephyr. A long while later, she finally responded, How did you do it? Ezra offhandedly said, My senses are just above average. The curvy girl did not probe any further, but the slim and violent lady showed a dissatisfied face. After a slight hesitation, she finally said in a soft voice, Thanks. She knew that she was the big winner this time. Ezra had greatly increased her efficiency, something that Rashi would never be able to achieve. The prince waved his hand. You provided the money, and I provided the effort. Each of us is just fulfilling the other's needs. It's getting late. You may find me here during the next 10 days. I'll do my best to let you reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique before these 10 days are over. After he finished speaking, he waved as he turned and left in a carefree manner, leaving only the fragments of black lightning bolts. The Duel ladies watched him leave as they gave each other a look. It was a long time later before Ravina finally mumbled to herself in a soft voice. This guy is way too mysterious. In the following few days, having tasted the sweet fruits of success, Mahi came by the creek practically every day to receive Ezra's aid in mastering the Gossamer Steps technique. With Ezra Zephyr's help, she progressed by leaps and bounds. In a short 4 days, the number of yarns she had knitted rose from 8 to 25. One must know that the later yarns would become harder and harder to sense. In a normal situation, Mahi would at best knit 5 yarns in 4 days. The rapid progress under Ezra Zephyr's guidance slightly alarmed even Ravina herself. Hence, even someone as prideful as her was now a little more respectful when she saw Ezra Zephyr during these few days. However, the prince did not pay much heed to her change in attitude. After all, the spirit jades he wanted were already his. The only thing that bothered him was that this tiny amount of spirit jade was still nowhere near enough to rent out the high-tier gamma layer skill, 8 Lost Dragons. Ezra Zephyr was seated on a rock, his eyes shut in prowess, while Mahi and Gale was also present nearby. The prince suddenly opened his eyes as he slowly expelled a breath of spiritual energy from his mouth. At this moment, a peculiar undulation spread from his body. One could only watch as half his body gradually turned incorporeal, giving off a faint feeling of transparency. You've mastered the first level? A shocked voice sounded from the side. Mahi and Gale had opened her eyes and was now staring at Ezra Zephyr in bewilderment. Making half of one's body gossamer was only achievable when one reached the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. Ezra's expression did not change as he swept her a look and said, You've already completed 25 yarns, is it that strange for me to reach the first level? Mahi froze momentarily, feeling a little foolish due to how shocked she was. When she thought about it, however, she felt that it was a very normal reaction. It was after all far too rare for someone to reach the first level in such a short span of time. Now that I've mastered the first level, any attack that lands on my body will have its power neutralized by nearly 30%. A satisfied look filled his eyes as he looked at his etherealized hand. Do not look down on this 30%, because it would often be enough to bring about a reversal in battle. Of course, the neutralization effect was not absolute, and there existed certain special methods that could counter it. If not, the Gossamer Steps technique would not be limited to a mere mid-tier little gamma layer technique, but instead be qualified to enter the ranks of even the delta, or even higher, omega. All in all, the Gossamer Steps technique would greatly boost one's survivability on all fronts. You're actually pretty low-key, hee. Mahi suddenly laughed as she looked at Ezra Zephyr. Although you appear to be a second-level core formation, after spending these past few days with you, I've come to realize that you should have a place amongst the recently established Outer Mountains top 10. Nearly half a month had passed since the many disciples arrived at the spirit-devouring mountain. The acclimatization period was basically over for everyone, causing them to naturally shift their attention to competing and comparing. As such, after some estimation and general consensus, the Outer Mountain disciples came up with the so-called 10 Great Outer Mountain Disciples. It had spread like wildfire during the past 2 days, making it one of the hottest topics in the Outer Mountains. The one who stood at the top was, to no one's surprise, Drake Tubble, while Ravina Ingale was second. Amongst the 10 great unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, 7 were geniuses from the Shurien and Ryan continents, while only 3 were from the other continents, and it just so happened that Ash Beckham was number 10. As for Ezra Zephyr, no one had even mentioned him. He was after all an early second-level core formation, and there appeared to be just too huge of a gap between him and the third-layer core formation disciples. However, Mahi was clearly not of the same opinion, hence her previous words. From what she could see, Ezra was too good at concealing his strength. If he wanted to, he would surely have a place amongst the 10 great unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. The prince merely chuckled when he heard this. Is there any meaning to these rankings? It's not the peak selection ceremony will be decided based on it. At the mountain, Ezra stood on a rock. He was indeed not the slightest bit interested in it. After all, the higher one was ranked, the more humiliating it would be if one ended up being unable to match up in the peak selection ceremony. Moreover, it was preposterous that talent such as XYR had not even been included in the 10 great unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, a fact that only made Ezra Zephyr look down on its weight. He knew that if XYR were to act, even Drake would not be his dual martial spirits match. Mahi frowned slightly. We're all youngsters, if we don't have aspirations, we won't have drive. How then will we aim for even greater heights? You're the weird one, so young and yet so similar to an old man. Ezra smiled as he got close to Mahi's ear, his warm breath tingled her neck as he said. I have experience of old and body of a young. Mahi flinched. Well, what do you mean? She blushed. Oh? Just as Ezra was about to flirt more, he suddenly sensed something and lifted his head towards a certain direction where the sound of rushing wind could be heard. A figure hurriedly flew over, his round, fat figure making it painfully apparent as to who it was. It was naturally Gil Subzi. Gil was currently dripping with sweat. The moment he caught sight of Ezra, he hastily shouted, Your Majesty, Moshi is heading here with several others. They don't look friendly at all. Moshi? Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. It seemed that the 2 brothers had finally reached their limits. He knew that it was impossible for Rashi to silently sit by when Ezra had snatched Mahi and Gale away. Is Rashi amongst them? Asked Ezra. If Rashi was coming too, Ezra would have to use some hidden means. After all, a good man would not purposely suffer for no reason. No matter how arrogant he would not directly face an official Outer Mountain disciple like Rashi when he was only at the second-level core formation stage. Nope. Gil shook his head. The prince let out a carefree laugh. If Rashi wasn't coming, a mere insect like Moshi would not be able to cause any trouble. Gil only grew even more worried at the sight of Ezra's carefree appearance. Though Moshi was not part of the 10 great outer disciples, he was still above average amongst the first-class disciples, his strength far surpassing Pelioc's. After his defeat at the hands of XYR, it only took him 1 week to get back his seat by defeating someone else. While they conversed, the sound of rushing wind had already approached the entrance to the mountain. The prince soon saw a dozen figures fly over, landing a short distance from the creek. The one leading the group was naturally Moshi. Moshi stared at Ezra Zephyr with hostility as he frostily said, "Ezra, I do not know what kind of honeyed words you used to scam fellow sister Mahi and Gale, but I advise you to stop with your tricks because you will not be able to bear the responsibility of affecting her training." Mahi's pretty face immediately turned ice cold as she angrily said, "Moshi, what does where I train have to do with you? You'd better get lost before I call Sister Ravina." Her bright eyes icily looked towards Moshi and the gang, causing them to stumble slightly in response. However, Moshi was not scared off by this, summoning his courage as he said, "Sister Mahi, we're doing this for your sake. You should not listen to this guy's flowery words." Mahi's anger turned to laughter. "Flowery words? Do you fools know what level I've reached while practicing the Gossamer Steps technique with him? I've already knitted 25 yarns. If I were to continue under Rashi instead, I don't think I'll even reach 15, right?" Moshi's expression changed slightly, while the other disciples looked towards Mahi in disbelief as they involuntarily cried out, 25? How can that be? However, they knew that someone like Mahi would never lower herself to lie to them. Could Ezra really be so capable? Moshi's expression fluctuated indeterminately. Soon after, he looked towards the prince in contempt and said, "All of us know how talented fellow sister Mahi is, so it's not surprising for her to accomplish this in a few days. But I'm afraid you don't have the qualifications to take credit for her success." His words were clear, insinuating that Mahi's amazing talent was the only reason for her accomplishments, and had nothing to do with Ezra Zephyr. Mahi's earlier words were merely her trying to defend him. The others inwardly nodded upon hearing this, finding this the more acceptable explanation. After all, they would rather believe in Mahi's astonishing talent than a mere second-level core formation having such capability. Mahi was so frustrated that she no longer knew what to say. The brains of these people were too good at coming up with bullshit. Just as she was about to begin scolding again, Ezra Zephyr stopped her with an outreached hand. He helplessly said, "It is useless for you to reason with them." Mahi looked at Ezra in response. "When you encounter such people, there's no need to talk too much." Ezra Zephyr smiled at Mahi as something seemed to slowly climb up in his eyes. "Didn't you say something about me earlier? I recall you saying I'm like an old man. Let me show you how an old man spanks the young kids." His gaze turned towards Moshi and the rest, his grin widening with a hint of blade-like iciness. At the final word, Ezra's expression turned completely cold as ice, berserk black lightning abruptly erupting from his body like a storm. Behind him, a strange splendor appeared in Mahi's eyes as she gazed at the now overbearing young man who gave off an incomparably pressuring aura. It was as if the current Ezra Zephyr and the gentle young man who usually taught her were two completely different people. Black lightning violently thundered out from Ezra Zephyr's body, rapidly dancing around him like chaotic bolts as his aura steadily rose. In front of him, Moshi and gang were first stunned by the prince's sudden change, but upon hearing his words, every one of them began to see red. "What the heck did you just say?" Moshi became angry, his eyes filled with ridicule as he disdainfully said, "Taking us all on alone? Who do you think you are? Do you really believe that defeating Pelioc has given you the qualifications to show such arrogance in the face of real first-class disciples like us?" Though his feat of defeating Pelioc in a single punch had been pretty shocking, it was really nothing to be proud of to Moshi and the rest. Pelioc was only a second-class disciple, his strength merely at the second-level core formation. Hence, Ezra's current appearance was extremely comical to them, as if they were looking at a clown. Moshi's laughter continued for quite some time before finally coming to a halt. He was actually pretty happy that Ezra Zephyr had voluntarily jumped out. After all, the former had indeed come here today to cause trouble. Even if Ezra had not voluntarily spoken up earlier, Moshi would not easily let the matter rest. You can forget all of us ganging up on you, it is far too shameful. Moshi shook his head, a sliver of iciness rising in his eyes as he looked towards Ezra Zephyr and said, "Your flowery words are useless against me, so I will be using my fists to reveal your true colors in front of Mahi and Gale." He took a step forward as powerful spiritual energy abruptly burst out from his body, the full might of the third-level core formation undoubtedly on full display. By the side, Gil Subzi was intimidated by Moshi's pressure, causing his expression to change slightly as worry emerged in his eyes. Moshi was after all pretty famous amongst the first-class disciples. After his defeat to XYR, he worked twice as hard and also manages to knit 10 yarn of Gossamer Steps technique. Seeing that a fight was about to break out, Gil Subzi's gaze kept darting towards the outside of the mountain. Swish. The sound of rushing wind was suddenly heard at this moment, rapidly approaching the creek as a cold and stern shout rang out, "Moshi, if you plan on taking on Brother Ezra Zephyr, you'll have to first ask for my permission." Several figures of light landed, revealing their appearance. The one leading them was Ash Beckham. They had evidently heard the news, and were afraid that Ezra Zephyr would be in for a hard time. Hence, they had hurried over to lend their aid. Ash wore a solemn expression as powerful spiritual energy pulsed around him. Things had been going pretty well for him over the past half a month, even gaining the title of one of the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples. Although he was only ranked 10th, the fact that he was able to enter the ranks as a non-Shurian and Ryan Continent's disciple was enough to show his ability. Moshi frowned when he saw Ash, a trace of wariness in his eyes. Ash Beckham was after all 10th amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples, an individual that was indeed more powerful than himself. Even so, there was no fear on Moshi's face as he indifferently said, "Ash, this matter does not concern you. It will be best if you do not interfere." The leader of non-Shurian faction responded in a low voice, "You are the one who should not be too overbearing. Brother Ezra is not someone who actively stirs up trouble. Why must you provoke him?" Mockery rose from the corners of Moshi's mouth. "We weren't the ones provoking him, he was the one who just declared that he will take us all on alone." The others laughed loudly in accompaniment. Ash Beckham's expression sunk slightly. "If you insist on making things difficult, don't blame me later on." Moshi's eyes hardened as he said, "Don't think for a second that I am afraid of you. I only said so much earlier to give you some face. There should be some amongst you that are learning the Gossamer Steps technique from my elder brother, right?" The threat in his final few words was already clear as day. Ash's expression changed a little, evidently not expecting Moshi to so shamelessly use that to threaten him. However, he was no coward. Since he had already decided to reveal himself, he would not be so easily frightened off by Moshi. Without further ado, spiritual energy began to stir as his piercing gaze looked towards Moshi. The latter likewise did not expect Ash Beckham to be so stubborn, causing his expression to turn somewhat ugly. "Haha, it seems that you're pretty fond of sticking your doggy paws into other people's business. Since you're so free, why not exchange a move or two with me?" Just as Moshi's expression turned ugly, a bout of laughter suddenly sounded as a figure of light flew over and landed nearby. It was a thin man who looked rather monkey-like, with a pair of deep-set eyes. However, the spiritual energy undulations from his body were in no way weaker than Ash Beckham's. Gil Subzi could not help but softly gasp at the sight of this person, its son Jingle. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. He had heard this name before. It was said that he was ranked 9th amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples, one position higher than Ash. It seems that Moshi had predicted Ash's interference and invited this expert over to help. The expression in Ash Beckham's eyes sunk when he saw the monkey-like young man as he sighed inside. It seems that Moshi was not going to let this matter go with words alone. Ezra Zephyr looked over at this moment and smiled at Ash Beckham. "Brother Ash, I can handle things here." Ezra was already very pleased that Ash Beckham had come to his aid so many times. Ash let out a bitter laugh. Be careful, brother Ezra. Although he was very optimistic about Ezra's future, the latter was currently only at the second-level core formation stage. In contrast, Moshi was already a veteran of third-level core formation stage. In a clash between them, Ezra would likely be much worse off. The werewolf prince smiled in a carefree manner, before lifting his head to look towards Moshi. I'll ask you one last time, are you certain all of you aren't coming together? Moshi's expression darkened as he sneered. Still talking so big, looks like I have to beat the sense in you. BBZZZZ. Without the slightest shred of hesitation, spiritual energy violently erupted as his expression turned serious. He immediately took the initiative, his body akin to flash of light as he bolted towards Ezra Zephyr. A palm was swung horizontally, creating several palm shadows that homed in on Ezra Zephyr's fatal spots in a flash. Moshi's attack was extremely vicious, showing no mercy at all. Ash Beckham, Gil Subzi, and the rest watched with anxious eyes. They had realized that Ezra was not moving, as if he had no intention of avoiding. You dare to display such carelessness before me, do you think that I'm Peliok? Moshi let out an eerie laugh, under the impression that Ezra was just being foolish. However, the former did not restrain his power, but instead poured even more ferocity into his attack. In the end, several palm shadows landed on Ezra's body. Thump thump. Muffled thuds continued to sound one after another as the aftershocks wreaked havoc in the surroundings, tearing up the ground around Ezra Zephyr. Every gaze on the mountain was tightly fixed on the fight. Is that guy stupid or what? To think that he did not even try to avoid Moshi's attack? The group that had come here with Moshi laughed mockingly. The dust gradually settled. In the next instant, the mocking smiles that hung from the corners of their mouths slowly turned rigid. Ezra was still standing there, his figure unmoved from the spot. His expression was one of indifference, and not a single wound could be seen on his body, as the earlier attack had zero effect on him. How can this be? Astonished cry after cry rang out. Impossible. Moshi's pupils violently tightened. He had held nothing back earlier, and every attack had indeed solidly landed on Ezra's body. But why? Why had every attack seemed to sink into his body as if it was a stone being thrown into the vast sea, giving no feedback at all? The prince's expression did not change, merely frowning slightly as gazed at Moshi and dully asked, "You haven't eaten well these days?" Moshi's expression filled with embarrassment and anger. With a loud yell, spiritual energy frantically converged towards his palm as his 5 fingers tightly clenched. A punch was sent forth, the punch winds rumbling like thunder. Bomb. A punch that had enough power to turn a boulder to dust slammed into Ezra Zephyr's chest. Under Ezra's clothes, his chest area had turned gossamer, while purple dragon scales had emerged. The purplish scales of dragon pelt technique possessed strong defensive capabilities. Now that there was also the Gossamer Steps technique neutralizing a portion of the power, Moshi's full power punch was unable to pierce Ezra's defenses. Therefore, Ezra Zephyr's body didn't budge an inch. He stared at Moshi and remarked, "Looks like you really have not eaten, or maybe your mother was busy warming beds when you needed breast milk for strong bones, 'cause your punch is really shitty." The others were stupefied by this sight. His defense is so strong? Even the pupils of Ash Beckham and Sun Jingle shrank a little. If they were the ones in his place, it would be impossible for them to come out unscathed after taking a direct hit from Moshi's full power punch with their bodies. Moshi was shocked and horrified. As he blankly stared at Ezra Zephyr's body, he suddenly discovered that the latter's chest area had turned rather gossamer, and was abruptly struck by a flash of understanding. A piercing voice filled with both terror and astonishment immediately rang out. You've mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique?" Moshi's horrified voice caused disbelief to fill the faces of everyone else present with the exception of Mahi and Gale, making them dumbstruck as they stared at Ezra Zephyr. How is this possible? It's only been a few days, how can he possibly have mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique? But gossomeriness of the body is clearly only achievable by someone who has mastered the first level. This is the only way to explain how he was able to receive Moshi's attacks with his body. Ash and his allies were stunned as they looked at each other. The Gossamer Steps technique was one of the more popular spiritual techniques in the Outer Mountains, and had been selected by many disciples. This was because of how amazing it was. Once mastered, it would substantially boost one's overall survivability. But they also knew that although many people were learning it, only a handful were able to reach the first level. Mastering the first level in a span of less than 10 days was practically unheard of. In addition, they knew that Ezra had not received any guidance during this process. Everything had been achieved with his own ability. Could it be? Mahi was only able to progress so rapidly in the Gossamer Steps technique because she chose to learn under Ezra? Ash's mouth subconsciously hung slightly open. Truth be told, they had felt Mahi's choice of Ezra over Rashi was way too weird. If they were not well acquainted with Ezra and knew that Mahi was not some easily love-struck girl, they would have likely believed that there was something going on between the two. White and green interlaced on Moshi's face, some horror still lingering in his eyes. Never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined Ezra had actually mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. While Moshi was still lost in shock, the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom lightly tapped his chest under everyone's gazes and said in a calm voice, "I told you earlier that all of you should come at me together, and yet you kept insisting on taking me on alone since that is so." By the time Ezra's voice faded, his body had already moved. Half of his body seemed to turn invisible as he took a step forward. Faint wind appeared around him as his figure swiftly shot forward like the wind. Such speed! Moshi's heart shivered. Ezra was so quick that even he was beginning to see faint after images. In the face of the current Ezra, Moshi no longer displayed any of the arrogance from before. His feet rapidly moved as his figure hastily retreated in a rather miserable manner. However, his speed was far from being able to match Ezra Zephyr's. He merely took a single step forward and appeared in front of Moshi like a phantom. No matter how Moshi tried to evade, the werewolf's figure closely followed like a shadow. This speed, Ash Beckham and Sun Jingle's expressions changed slightly when they saw this. Get lost. Moshi was scared stiff by Ezra's phantom-like speed. The humiliation and anger in the former's heart reached its peak, and with a howl, berserk spiritual energy unfurled from his body, dashing in all directions. SWWUSSH. However, Ezra's figure merely flickered a few times, breaking through the wave of spiritual energy as purplish scales appeared on his hand. Black lightning danced around it. A palm strike was swiftly sent forth, instantly piercing Moshi's defenses and landing on his chest. Bam! Black lightning exploded, and Moshi's body was sent catapulting backwards as if he had been struck by a heavy blow. However, mere moments after his figure was sent flying, Ezra's somewhat gossamer figure appeared below the former as a kick lashed out along with black lightning. Zot! A whip-like leg ripped through the air, kicking Moshi in the stomach as he let out a miserable cry and was sent flying once again. Boom bomb. The crowd's eyelids twitched as they watched Moshi's body being bounced around in midair, unable to land. It was an exceedingly wretched sight. The mountain was blanketed in silence, everyone speechless as they watched Ezra Zephyr effortlessly kick Moshi around like a ball, a sight that caused them to shiver involuntarily. Especially the disciples that had come with Moshi. They had originally believed Ezra would be easily crushed, allowing him to understand his place. But who could have expected that the third-level core formation expert Moshi would be unable to even touch Ezra's shadow, and would end up being hit around like a ball? What are you guys still standing around for? Go get him together. In the side, Sun Jingle, who had been watching till he was now somewhat irritated, lost his composure and howled. These disciples looked to each other. In the end, they ignored the fact that they were going to gang up on Ezra Zephyr and forced themselves forward, surrounding him from all directions. I already told you guys to come at me together earlier, but you guys just had to insist on wasting time. Ezra Zephyr chuckled softly when he saw them approach as the mist around him thickened, causing his speed to soar once again. Crackle crackle. Chaos lightning thundered. He was akin to the shadow of a phantom as he charged into the midst of the dozen or so disciples. Bang bomb. The battle was a completely chaotic mess. Although these disciples were pretty strong, they were unable to even touch the edges of Ezra Zephyr's black clothes. In contrast, whenever Ezra's figure dashed past, a fist covered in purplish scales along with blackish lining toned by a dim red flicker would slam into their bodies without any trace of politeness. Each punch molded itself into the flesh, painting an exceptionally violent picture, mutilating that part of the body. In a short few minutes, the ground was littered with bodies, each one with a bloody nose and torn face, traces of blood at the corner of their mouths as they groaned in pain. At the middle, Ezra stood with his hands by his side as his partially incorporeal body gradually returned to normal. His expression was still indifferent, unchanged even through the entire ordeal. He looked towards the ground in front of him where Moshe was staggering to his feet. The latter had received the most of Ezra's care, making him look the most pitiful of the bunch. His teeth broken, jaw shattered, bones fractured, AMD muscles dilapidated. Moshe trembled uncontrollably as he gazed upon the werewolf prince, a trace of terror in his eyes. He truly never imagined that they would lose in such a miserable manner even after the dozen or so of them ganged up on Ezra Zephyr. Now that Ezra had mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique, he was not only untouchably quick, but his defense was also extremely terrifying, allowing him to practically ignore their attacks. One must know that there were two other first-class disciples amongst the group that had the strength of the third-level core formation. But even so, they had been easily dealt with by Ezra Zephyr. How crazy was this? Even the outer mountain top 10 disciples such as Ash Beckham and Sun Jingle did not dare to claim they would be able to so effortlessly deal with several first-class disciples without taking any damage. After today, Brother Ezra Zephyr will definitely have a spot as one of the 10 great outer mountain disciples. Ash could not help but sigh in mixed feelings. Ezra had previously been way too low profile. Although he had obtained victory over Peliok, it had only made others feel that he was at least worthy of being a first-class disciple, though many believed that he was one of the lowest ranking amongst them. After today's battle, there was likely no one would continue to say so. This battle was enough for his name to shake the outer mountains. Sun Jingle's expression had turned rather grave, wariness now present in his eyes as he stared at Ezra Zephyr. The former had not taken the latter very seriously earlier, which led to his prompt agreement when Moshe had asked him for support. But now, he was feeling a slight bit of regret. Ezra was clearly not as simple as he looked, and Sun Jingle had now offended him for no real reason. Ezra caught his gaze and grinned at him before crying out loud. "Come forward." Swish whoosh frum. A large number of martial masters jumped from the nearby mountain, covering the whole sky like locusts. They all landed and quickly bent their knees before Ezra Zephyr. They were the disciples of Naran Continent, around 500 in numbers. XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Argus Waska, Shifa Pista, and Urgale Arms. These 5 were in front. He, Your Majesty, how was my acting?" The fat guy Gil Subzi laughed loudly. Everyone baffled at the sight, and soon, some smart ones understood the meaning behind it. On which, Ezra smiled and winked at him. "You, over there," Ezra said as he pointed his finger at Sun Jingle. "My subordinates were enough to kill them all, but I wanted to show you who I am. I kept a low profile, but you still scratched my balls. Go and tell your people, all 7 seats of Shurien and Ryan will be taken by Naran Continent." The entire mountain range was filled with an uproar. Ezra Zephyr made a huge claim. Sun Jingle didn't say anything in response and kept looking at Ezra Zephyr with a grave face. Clap clap. Loud and clear clapping sounded from behind. One would find Mahi and Gale grinning as she watched this scene, an additional trace of admiration in her eyes when she looked at Ezra Zephyr. The way the prince had beaten them all up alone was clearly very much to her liking. The prince chuckled, growing increasingly satisfied with the Gossamer Steps technique. Although he would not fear the other party if he had not learnt the technique, he could still beat the shit out of them all. The Gossamer Steps technique allowed him to gossamer his physical body, greatly increasing his speed and thus making his movements extremely agile and nimble. When the defensive capabilities of the dragon pelt, black coat and his strong body was added, the strength of third-level core formation felt akin to a mosquito bite. He raised his head, his eyes uncaring as he glanced at the miserable figures of Moshi and gang. Although your elder brother Rashi is an official Outer Mountain disciple, he is very narrow-minded and petty. It was only a small dispute, and yet he tried to stop all the other Outer Mountain disciples from teaching me. If he did not possess the heaven-defying talent, he may have really been in some trouble. After all, the effectiveness would definitely be lower without anyone's guidance. Though Moshi did not dare to retort when he heard Ezra criticizing Rashi, the former Koldi snorted inside. His elder brother was an famous disciple after all, an existence that Ezra Zephyr would not dare to clash against directly even if he had mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. Ezra, we admit defeat this time, but don't be too happy yet. You won't have a good time after offending my elder brother," said Moshi through gnashed teeth. The prince merely smiled faintly. I believe I should be the one saying these words. Albeit the fact Moshi was in a pretty bad state, mockery still surfaced in his eyes as he sneered. Oh? What can you even do to my elder brother? Ezra seemed to smile upon seeing his expression, Moshi suddenly a sliver of unease, but he could not figure out what Ezra was planning. The prince's gaze looked towards the other disciples that had followed Moshi here. They were basically the disciples that were learning the Gossamer Steps technique from Rashi. From today, I will begin teaching the Gossamer Steps technique. As for my effectiveness, you can look to Mahi and Gale as an example. I guarantee that everyone under my tutelage will reach the first level of the technique in a month. As for the price, Rashi charges 5 spirit jade pieces a day, so mine will be the same. If any of you are interested, you can transfer over any time. The mountain was deathly silent, even Ashbeka and Sun Jingle were dumbstruck as they blankly stared at Ezra Zephyr. No one had expected that Ezra was planning on brazenly recruiting disciples and teach them the Gossamer Steps technique. At this point, Ezra spoke again. Oh, and yes. 5 spirit jade pieces, JS the price of non-Shurien, non-Ryan and non-Naren disciples. Everyone was confused, they understood Shurien and Ryan, but why Naren was excluded. The disciples of Naren do not have to pay, they will be taught free of charge. However, Shurien and Ryan disciples must pay 15 spirit jade pieces for tutelage. Moshi blankly stared at Ezra as his scalp suddenly numbed. He had realized that if Ezra really did as he had said, Moshi's elder brother was going to have a pretty hard time in the subsequent days. After all, even Rashi did not dare to guarantee helping someone else master the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month. Ezra's declaration was basically going to cut off Rashi's income. This counterattack could be said to be merciless to the extreme. Everyone foolishly stared at Ezra Zephyr after listening to his words. The shock factor of these words were clearly even greater than his feat of beating down the entire group alone. None of them had ever heard of someone giving guidance to other disciples while he was still an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple. Moreover, none of the official Outer Mountain disciples had ever dared to claim they could help the disciples under their tutelage reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month. Even Rashi did not have the ability. Hence, Ezra Zephyr's words somewhat tempted even Ashbekam. He may not have chosen to learn the Gossamer Steps technique, but if Ezra Zephyr was truly able to help him reach the first level in a month, he did not mind starting from scratch. After all, they understood how difficult it was to learn a gamma layer technique. The amount of time and effort required was tremendous, and reaching initial mastery in a month was already amazingly fast. Moshi's complexion paled, cold sweat appearing on his forehead as horror filled his eyes. He never imagined that Ezra would publicly claim something so big. The prince grinned. Is there a rule that says an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple can't give guidance to others? Moshi froze, the expression on his face fluctuating indeterminately as he looked towards the individuals around him. These people had been learning the Gossamer Steps technique from his elder brother, but their gazes were now flickering slightly in thought, evidently tempted by Ezra Zephyr's words. It was clear to them after all. If they continued with Rashi, the cost was not only higher, but they may not even reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month. In comparison, Ezra Zephyr's quality-to-price ratio was undoubtedly better. Moshe began to panic as he hurriedly said, "Don't be bewitched by him. Even if he can reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique, it does not mean that he will be able to help others do the same in a month. Mahi and Gail is super talented, how can you guys compare your progress to hers?" He was aware that coming to the outer mountains to teach was a nice cushy job that his elder brother had gone through many difficulties to acquire. It was after all a job where Gossamer Steps could be earned more easily. If Ezra Zephyr were to suddenly stick his hand into this pie, Rashi would end up being akin to someone who uses a wicker basket to collect water. Moshe's words made the other disciple hesitate somewhat. After all, when Ezra Zephyr and Rashi were compared, the latter's status was more trustworthy. Moshe did not dare to linger any longer, afraid that they would be enticed away. He frostily looked towards Ezra Zephyr and said, "Ezra, one should always leave a way out. If you really intend to teach the Gossamer Steps technique, my elder brother will not take this lying down." His words and tone implied both a threat and a warning. However, Ezra Zephyr's expression did not change as he smiled faintly and replied, "Did you guys leave me a way out when you collaborated with the other instructors to stop me from learning spiritual techniques?" If he did not have a few tricks up his sleeve, he would have likely been hard-pressed due to Rashi's actions. Any ordinary person would have had his future ruined by the latter. After all, the competition in the spirit-devouring mountain was just too intense. Being delayed a single step would oftentimes lead to one being unable to surpass another again. Moshe icily said, "You stubborn fool, just wait for the fury of my elder brother to descend. Go." With a wave of his sleeve, he took the lead and left, though his figure appeared a little pathetic. The other disciples hesitated for a moment. In the end, they still chose to follow. Ezra Zephyr did not feel their departure was the least bit unfortunate. "Haha, Your Majesty, are you really planning on teaching the other disciples the Gossamer Steps technique? From what I know, there are at least 100 people amongst the outer mountain disciples that are practicing it. If all of them came here to learn from you, you will receive an income of several hundred spirit jade pieces per day." Gil Subzi's eyes were practically glowing, saliva nearly dripping from his mouth. After doing the calculations, he realized that the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom could become the richest amongst the unofficial outer mountain disciples in a month. Ezra Zephyr's heart involuntarily beat a little faster when he heard this. The truth was, he had only said so earlier to take revenge on Rashi, but now that he gave some thought to it, he realized that it was practically the best way to rake in huge amounts of spirit jade. In comparison, going to the task pavilion every day to take on some missions now seemed akin to tough, meaningless labor. Ezra Zephyr's gaze stealthily lit up with excitement and desire. As long as a third of those practicing the Gossamer Steps technique came to him, his coffers would be overflowing with money. With such wealth, he can help out the Naren disciples to reach higher positions and might be able to rent the 8 lost dragons' skills that he desired. "You seem to know quite a lot." Ezra looked towards Gil Subzi with a wide smile. "Are you interested in helping me with this venture?" Gil patted his chest, a dazzling light in his eyes as he responded, "You've found the right man for the job, Your Majesty. Such matters are my forte. I will first help you spread the news of this, especially to the disciples that are learning the Gossamer Steps technique. I'm sure many disciples will be tempted by your guarantee of reaching the first level in a month. As long as we take it one step at a time, I dare say that not even a single figure will be seen at Rashi's place in the end." Ezra began to smirk as he listened. Gil's aid would indeed save him a lot of trouble. Ezra turned his eyes to another man, who had a gloomy face. It was the Gale Arms. Until now, he was the strategist of Ezra, but now his competitor has arrived who is more expert in the words game than him. "There, I have a task for you as well. Something that only you can do," said Ezra. Dur's eyes glittered. "Your Majesty, I'm honored, give me your command." Ezra smiled. "Not now, we'll tell you soon." At the mountain, Ash Beckham's eyes burned with desire as he looked towards Ezra Zephyr and asked, "Brother Ezra, Can you really allow other disciples to reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month? Ezra pondered a little and asked Fenrir before he replied, "It should not be much of an issue if I have a month, but I can only guarantee the first level. The subsequent levels are another matter. The later yarns would only grow more and more difficult to sense." Hence, Ezra did not intend to waste all of his effort helping others knit their yarns. If he did, where would he find the time for his own cultivation? Ash sighed in admiration. Soon after, he smiled and said, "Then I'll also be renting out the Gossamer Steps technique when I return." As one of the most popular choices amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, Ash Beckham naturally knew how formidable the Gossamer Steps technique was. He had only given up on it for the time being because he also understood how troublesome it was to knit the yarns. Ezra chuckled and said, "You guys can learn free of charge." Ash Beckham was a pretty decent person, and Ezra had a very favorable impression of him. Hence, the latter naturally did not mind lending a hand to the former. Ash did not argue upon hearing this, merely grinning as he said, "Then I'll have to give my thanks." Learning a spiritual technique was very costly, so he did not want to end up paying more than he should because of pride. He intended to save every bit he could. Ash remarked, "When news of this spreads, I'm afraid Brother Ezra will become the most famous person amongst the Outer Mountain disciples." It was true. After all, such a thing had never happened before. Besides this, Brother Ezra needs to be a little more careful with regard to Rashi. This venture of yours can be said to have threatened his livelihood. I'm afraid he will not silently let this matter rest. When all was said and done, Rashi was still an official Outer Mountain disciple, possessing status and strength beyond unofficial Outer Mountain disciples like them. Ezra chuckled and nodded. He was not overly worried about Rashi. If that fellow really lost his rationality and directly struck at Ezra, he would simply release Caver and twinkle at him. Ash and Gil worked out a few other details before leaving. Excitement colored their eyes when they left, clearly already able to imagine how huge this would be once news of Ezra giving guidance on the Gossamer Steps technique spread in the Outer Mountains. As Mahi and Gale watched them leave, she lifted her head and smiled superficially at Ezra. "Zephyr, your ambition is not small. I wonder how much spirit jade you will earn when you succeed." No one asked them to keep targeting me as if they had nothing better to do. Ezra shrugged. If not for Rashi's overbearingness, the former would not be so ruthless. "You're only teaching the first level of the Gossamer technique?" Mahi suddenly changed the topic. The prince smiled and answered, "The latter part is too difficult, and I won't be of much help. You'll have to rely on yourself." Mahi pouted slightly. "I somehow feel that it's not that you can't, but that you don't want to, right?" Ezra raised his eyebrows. The intuition of a woman was terrifyingly sharp. The smile on Mahi's lips grew even wider when she saw Ezra's lack of a response as she said in a low voice, "It seems that you've acknowledged it with your silence. Teach me till the second level then." The prince shook his head. Rejected. The second level required much more effort than the first, and clearly could not be compared. Mahi and Gale's face seemed to become more charming after Ezra's clear rejection. She sauntered up to him, breathing a little heavier than normal as she seductively blew at his ear. "Ezra, my family's old ancestor is the master of Heavenly Fiend Peak. What do you think will happen if I tell him that you bullied me?" The smile that hung from the corners of Ezra's mouth turned slightly rigid. He did not expect Mahi's backer to be one of the 7 peak masters of the spirit-devouring mountain. Wasn't that way too much? "That's a little unreasonable, right?" the prince said with a smile. Mahi and Gale blinked innocently as she said in a sweet voice, "Reasoning with a girl? Are you stupid?" Ezra Zephyr said, "May I ask what kind of compensation I will get?" Ezra Zephyr laughed and got close to Mahi. He leaned forward towards her cheek. Mwah. A peck on Mahi's cheek, her eyes widened and her face turned red. Ezra Zephyr said in a similar low voice, "I got my compensation." Mahi got her senses back and nerked her head here and there to see if anyone saw that. Thankfully, no one was there. When she turned again to see Ezra, he was not there anymore. She touched her cheek gently and bolted away with a blush on her face. The events that had occurred by the creek in the mountain spread as if it had wings, stirring up the entire outer mountains into a frenzy. First of all, everyone was amazed and astonished by the strength Ezra had displayed. A single individual mowing down Moshe and other first-class disciples? How strong did one needed to be to achieve such a feat? One must know that Ezra Zephyr was currently still at the second-level core formation stage. The previous 10 great Outer Mountain disciples had not even taken Ezra into consideration. After all, many felt that although he had overwhelmed Peliok, it had only proven that he was qualified to be a first-class disciple. On the other hand, these 10 great Outer Mountain disciples were supposed to be the finest even amongst all the first-class disciples, so they believed Ezra clearly did not have the qualifications to enter their ranks. However, no one had expected someone who supposedly did not have the qualifications to turn out to be such a fierce individual. Taking on an entire group alone that even included 3 first-class disciples, and achieving an almost effortless victory. This was something that only a few of the current 10 great Outer Mountain disciples could accomplish. Hence, the strength displayed by Ezra once again made all of the Outer Mountain disciples exclaim in admiration. However, these feelings only lasted for a moment before being completely swept away by another piece of news. What else could it be but Ezra's offer to teach disciples the Gossamer Steps technique? What a joke, he's an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple just like us, and yet he dares to claim he can teach the Gossamer Steps technique? This is too laughable. But I've heard that Ezra's Gossamer Steps technique has already reached the first level. That's why Moshe and gang were defeated without even touching his clothes once. That can't be, right? How long has it been since he started learning the Gossamer Steps technique? In fact, I personally witnessed him renting it out just recently. Even Mahi and Gale is learning from him. I heard that she knitted over 20 yarns in a short few days. Could he really be so capable? TCH, Mahi is super talented, so it's not surprising for her to master it so quickly. Ezra is most likely boasting by taking credit for her success. I feel that we have to carefully consider this matter. Ezra may be trying to scam Spirit Jade. Similar opinions could be heard in every corner of the Outer Mountains, many debating whether Ezra had the qualifications to teach other disciples the Gossamer Steps technique. However, the majority were skeptical. After all, none of them were willing to believe that another unofficial Outer Mountain disciple would so greatly surpass them. Because it would only make them feel ashamed of their inferiority. The atmosphere in Rashi's lecture hall was somewhat oppressive. Numerous disciples were secretly whispering, evidently affected by the news. After all, the claims Ezra had made were rather shocking. The doors to the lecture hall were pushed open as an indifferent-looking Rashi walked in. He had a wooden leg that caused him to limp a bit. His arrival caused every whisper to instantly vanish. Rashi nonchalantly said, "I know that all of you have heard the news. If anyone wants to go over, feel free to leave." None of the disciples present dared to make any noise. Rashi was after all a legit Outer Mountain disciple, and it would not be good to offend him. Rashi's expression finally softened a little when he saw this. Ezra Zephyr does have his way with words, but he should be careful of eating more than his fill. Even if he was able to reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month, it does not mean that he can help anyone else do so. But Sister Mahi is said to have already knitted over 20 yarns. Said someone in a low voice. Ridicule rose from the corners of Rashi's mouth. Mahi is from Ingale clan and has astonishing talent. The old ancestor of her family is the master of the Heavenly Fiend Peak. He will have naturally given her some amazing treasures to aid her in mastering the Gossamer Steps technique. In fact, I'm of the opinion that Ezra Zephyr may have been so fast because he managed to bask some of Mahi and Gale's light. He is an exceptionally devious, cunning, and scheming person, as shown by how he approached Mahi and somehow gained her favor. However, he is far too arrogant. I'm looking forward to see how he will wrap this matter up after making such bold claims. Rashi's tone grew increasingly disdainful as he spoke. In the lecture hall, the disciples nodded inside as they listened, feeling that his words were not without logic. After all, they would rather believe Ezra had benefited from Mahi rather than succeeding through his own capabilities. Rashi's explanation eased the expressions of the disciples present as they began to make fun of Ezra's effort. The sight of this made Rashi chuckle softly as he began to speak once again. Ezra is really silly and arrogant to have made such claims. It would be fine if he can truly fulfill his promises, but if he can't, I will have no choice but to report this to the law enforcement hall. When that happens, Ezra will likely be kicked out of the outer mountains. Everyone's heart shivered as they secretly sighed in pity for Ezra. It could be said that he was going to bring about his own downfall this time. From Rashi's tone, he clearly held a deep grudge against Ezra and would not let this matter rest. It was still the same creek in the mountain. However, the usually tranquil mountain creek had now become the most popular location in the outer mountains. Black masses of people stood on both sides of the creek, their gazes filled with interest as they gazed down at the creek below where Ezra was standing on a rock, his expression cool and collected. Gil Subzi said from Ezra's side, "Your Majesty, we've already spread the news, but very few people believe us. Especially those Shurian disciples, all they do is mock." Ezra nodded, unsurprised by this information. The Shurian disciples were extremely arrogant after all, and looked down upon the disciples from the other continents. They would naturally be unwilling to believe Naren disciple like him would be able to do something that was impossible for them. As the saying went, every beginning is always difficult, so Ezra was mentally prepared for this. He lifted his head and shot a glance at both sides of the creek. These people were here for entertainment, not to learn the Gossamer Steps technique. "Your Majesty, Rashu has made known that if you do not fulfill your promises, he will report this matter to the law enforcement hall and get you convicted." Gil Subzi was pretty worried. "Let him do what he wants." Ezra nodded, showing no concern for this issue. "Haha, brother Ezra, we've come to cheer you on." Laughter was heard at this moment as Ash Beckham led a dozen figures towards the creek. Included in the group behind him were several non-Shurian disciples. Mahi was an influential figure. For her sake, some of Ryan continent came as well. They obviously knew that the starting would be the most awkward for Mahi as well, and had come here to make up the numbers. However, with the exception of Ash Beckham, most of the group were still rather doubtful. They only did not openly show it. They had agreed to follow mostly on account of Ash Beckham and Mahi and Gale. Laughter began to spread from both sides of the creek, evidently of the opinion that it was pretty embarrassing for Ezra to resort to such measures. "Brother Ash, is this really going to work? I feel like we're clowns." Beside Ash stood a pretty girl in a long dark blue skirt. She was called Telhai, and was also a pretty prideful first-class disciple. At this current moment, she was feeling a little uncomfortable under the many mocking gazes in the vicinity. Hence her earlier grumbling. Evidently, she too did not believe that Ezra Zephyr was able to teach the Gossamer Steps technique. Ash smiled awkwardly when he heard this, somewhat uncertain as he answered, "It should work out." Telhai unhappily rolled her eyes. "Brother Ash, you're too good-hearted." "Sister Telhai, Brother Ezra would only make such a claim because he is confident," said a girl called Shui in a soft voice. As someone who was also from the non-Shurian continent, she would naturally side with Ezra. "I hope so, or he will not be able to deal with the consequences." Telhai crossed her arms, declining to express any further opinions. While they were chatting, Ezra looked over. He knew that everyone would be doubtful, but he did not intend to convince them with words. Everything would be shown through facts. With so many people watching, he would make good use of this chance to show them the truth. "Let's begin." Every gaze in the vicinity of the mountain creek converged towards him when they heard him speak. Most of these gazes, however, were filled with doubt and ridicule. In the vicinity of the mountain creek, Mahi was gracefully standing nearby, her pretty eyes gazing towards the creek. "Tell me the truth, Mahi. Was he able to master the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique so quickly because he got some kind of amazing treasure from your old ancestor?" At Mahi's side was a young lady in pink clothes. She was rather pretty, her beauty enhanced by her limpid eyes. Her greatest assets, however, were the proud, astonishing curves on her chest that were tightly wrapped by her clothes, causing many of the surrounding male disciples to involuntarily cast a peek as they swallowed uncomfortably. Her beauty rivaled Mahi's. This girl was called Natli Tum, and was also a first-class disciple from the Ryan continent. She was rather well known in the outer mountains, though not as famous as Ravina and Mahi. She was also acquainted with Mahi, hence why she had taken the chance to secretly ask her earlier question. You believe such rumors? Mahi frowned as she glanced at the former. Natli chuckled. I feel that these so-called rumors are a little more believable than the alternative. Her eyes swept across Ezra's figure. Though there was no contempt in her gaze, it still contained a little of the pride all Ryan disciples had. Evidently, she too did not believe that a kid from some remote continent would be able to achieve something they Ryan and Shiryan disciples could not. Mahi shook her head, not bothering to explain anything. Another girl beside her said, just watch and see. It was Ravina in Gale. Natli was rather surprised by the deep trust Mahi and even Ravina had in Ezra, especially because she clearly knew how proud and distant the latter was. Ordinary disciples were unable to even catch her eye, and even Drake Tubble's repeated attempts to get close were only met by cold responses. Hence, Natli Tum was unable to wrap her head around why a blessed daughters of the heavens like Mahi and Ravina would have so much faith in a kid from this remote continent. Natli timidly said, Ravina, you seem to have become quite close to Ezra recently. I've heard that Drake is feeling very uncomfortable due to this. The red-haired Ravina frowned slightly. Is any of this Drake's business? Natli replied, do you still not understand his intentions? Ravina cast a sideways glance at the former. He asked you to speak for him? Natli smiled awkwardly. Ravina icily said, you can tell him that it will be in his best interests not to interfere. Or else, don't blame me for falling out with him. Natli helplessly said, I'm only a messenger, don't flare up at me. Natli coldly snorted, choosing not to speak any more as she looked towards the creek again, while Mahi laughed. Natli swallowed, and also turned towards the creek as she unhappily said, all right, I'm interested to see for myself just how capable this huge braggart is, that even our proud big Missy Ravina has acknowledged him. But I also hope that he isn't just full of hot air, or it will not be easy to wrap up this matter today. Let's begin. The moment Ezra's words sounded, countless amused gazes on both sides of the creek looked down towards him, as if waiting to watch an entertaining show. Ash Beckham, Telhai, Shuei and the rest exchanged a look, before seating themselves beside the creek. Brother Ezra, what do we do next? Asked Ash. Although he appeared relaxed, a sliver of anxiousness was visible in his eyes. After all, if Ezra failed today, the consequences would be very dire indeed. Just the mocking laughter of the numerous disciples present would likely drown him. What's more, Rashi had already declared that he would report Ezra to the law enforcement hall if he were to fail. This would likely result in Ezra Zephyr being kicked out of the outer mountains, an extremely terrible price to pay. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom casually said from the rock he was seated on, everyone should begin circulating the Gossamer Steps technique. Everyone closed their eyes upon hearing this, and began to circulate the Gossamer Steps technique. Under the attention of countless gazes, Ezra called out the chaos force from his body. It began to thunder as his hand grasped around it, the reddish-black bolts shooting out, turning into a dozen strings that wrapped around the wrists of Ash Beckham and the rest. I will send my senses into your bodies through the spiritual energy. When the time comes, you guys only need to release your control over your spiritual energy, and allow me to direct it. Ezra's voice was transmitted into everyone's ears. After hearing these words, Telhai could not help but blurt out in a low voice, can he really do it? What if he doesn't know what he's doing, and ends up causing our spiritual energy to lose control, which may in turn damage our channels? Ash hesitated for a moment. In the end, he gritted his teeth and said, relax everyone, Brother Ezra is not a reckless person. He understands the gravity of the situation. Ash was a reputable individual, so everyone else could only nod after hearing his words. No one else said anything as they began to direct the spiritual in their bodies, following the route indicated by the Gossamer Steps technique. As such, the area around the creek grew silent. Every gaze on both sides of the creek unblinkingly watched this scene. By the creek, the only sound to be heard was the gurgling of flowing water. Time seemed to slowly slip past as the water flowed. 2 hours quickly passed, however, there was still no activity. Natalie yawned as she said in a bored voice, "Is he out of moves or something?" Mahi frowned. "As someone who has not practices the Gossamer Steps technique, can you cut down on your comments? Sensing yarns is not that easy, and he's even doing it for a dozen people. How strong do you think his spiritual energy have to be?" After being scolded by calm and smiling Mahi, Natalie could only pout unhappily as she viciously stared at Ezra and said, "Then I'll watch and see how long he can keep up this act." Time continued to flow, and another 2 hours swift passed. Faint grumbling due to impatience could already be heard from both sides of the creek. Only the disciples that practiced the Gossamer Steps technique before understood its difficulty, and continued to wait in silence. Time continued to flow, and the 6-hour mark soon approached. Warm light fell from the sky, shining on Ezra's body, making the young man seem as if he was glowing brightly at this moment. It was at this very moment that Ezra's tightly shut eyes abruptly opened. "Release your control." Ezra's voice sounded in the ears of Ash and the rest, causing their hearts to shake violently as they involuntarily gave up control of the spiritual energy in their bodies. The instant this happened, they felt an external force direct the spiritual energy in their bodies, guiding it through their channels. A dozen minutes later, their spiritual energy suddenly turned, ferociously charging towards a certain spot in their bodies. Swoosh, swoosh. At the moment of impact, Ash, Telhai, and the rest suddenly felt a strong vibration spread from inside their bodies. Next, they were astonished to feel something being knitted at the location that energy had struck. A yarn had appeared within their senses. The energy in their bodies began to dribble in little by little. "Yes, it's really been knitted." Ash and the rest opened their eyes at this moment, eyes filled with disbelief. "Haha, it's been knitted, the yarn has appeared and knitted." Some of the others were unable to hold back their emotions as they began to dance and laugh. Hooray! An uproar exploded on both sides of the creek at this moment, every disciple dumbstruck by the outcome. What? Knitted? He helped a dozen people knit their yarns at the same time? Some of the disciples whom had practiced the Gossamer Steps technique even jumped in shock, a stunned look on their faces as they mumbled, "This can't be true, right?" They clearly understood how troublesome and difficult it was to sense yarns. And yet, Ezra had just succeeded in helping not only one, but a dozen individuals sense their yarns at the same time. Just how strong were his spiritual energy? It can't be. Natalie's mouth hung wide open, unable to stop herself from saying, "All of this must be part of an act, right?" After she said this, even she did not believe herself. After all, it was too easy to expose such an act. But if it wasn't an act, wouldn't that mean it was real? Natalie's eyes glimmered as she gazed at Ezra's figure and mumbled, "To think that he's truly so capable." The commotion did not stop for a long time, everyone stuck in shock. All of a sudden, everyone's burning gazes turned towards Ezra. The prince turned a blind eye to these gazes as he tiredly massaged his forehead. Helping a dozen people at once had indeed exhausted his spiritual energy. "Brother Ezra, you're way too amazing." Ash's face was flushed with excitement. Beside him, the lips of the girl called Telhai moved, the shock on her face yet to fade away completely. She had clearly been shocked silly by Ezra's feat. The prince waved his hand at them, before lifting his head and looking towards the countless figures on both sides of the creek with a calm expression as his indifferent voice sounded. "After my earlier testing, I've discovered that my ability is limited, so I've decided to restrict the maximum number to 100 individuals. I will no longer accept anyone once this number is reached." The prince's words instantly caused his surroundings to fall silent. Numerous disciples blinked. Didn't this mean there were only 100 quotas? The silence only lasted for a few minutes, before suddenly being disrupted by a chaotic outbreak. One could only watch as figure after figure descended like locusts, heading straight for the creek, while frenzied shouts rang out one after another. "Me. I want to sign up." "Me too. Big bro, please save a spot for me." Natalie Tom watched as mayhem descended upon the creek as she swallowed. Soon after, she smiled charmingly as she looked towards Ravina and sweetly said, "Ravina, you're quite close to Ezra. Can you tell him to help me in my technique too?" Ravina rolled her eyes, before also casting her gaze towards that figure below as a faint smile rose from the corners of her lips. This guy was now going to be famous. It only took half a day for Ezra's feat of simultaneously helping a dozen people unblock their yarns to spread to the entire outer mountains. A commotion immediately swept through countless disciples, each and every one unable to believe the news. The disciples that had practiced the Gossamer Steps technique were even more stupefied than their more ignorant counterparts. They were well aware that the hardest part of the technique was sensing the yarns, which required a tremendous amount of time. There were only 2 months left before the peak selection exam, and everyone was intensifying their efforts, making time become a more and more precious commodity. Many disciples had originally not taken it seriously, evidently believing that it was some kind of joke or farce. No one had imagined that this farce would result in such an outcome. By now, it had already been proven that Ezra did possess the ability to help others knit their yarns. Hence, the numerous disciples that were practicing the Gossamer Steps technique began to stir restlessly. Rashi was currently explaining something to the disciples present when a disturbance was suddenly felt from outside. He immediately frowned slightly, but before he could say anything, someone barged in and shouted, "Ezra Zephyr has simultaneously helped a dozen disciples knit their yarns." The lecture hall was instantly flooded with noise, the numerous disciples within completely dumbstruck. Rashi's reasoning from before had already convinced them that Ezra was merely a fraud. Who could have imagined that he would really succeed? The many disciples in the lecture hall looked to each other. In the end, their gazes eventually turned towards Rashi, looking at him in a strange manner. Rashi was clearly also stunned by the news, but his expression soon turned extremely dark and stormy. The corners of his mouth twitched uncontrollably, a clear sign of the violent rage that had surged out in his heart. But he ultimately took in a deep breath, suppressing the alarm and anger inside as he said in an icy voice, that kid probably found some actors to put on a show with him." At this time, he would never accept that Ezra was more capable than himself. However, the many disciples did not speak this time, their gazes flickering in thought. They understood that it was basically impossible for Ezra to pull off any tricks with so many people watching. Rashi was just being stubbornly unreasonable. Wouldn't this mean that Ezra did possess the astonishing capability to help others reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month? Everyone's hearts began to beat a little faster. If so, wouldn't this give them an advantage over others? In addition, they had heard it only same 5 spirit jade pieces a day there, with a much more competitive result than Rashi's. The atmosphere in the lecture hall had become rather bizarre. Although many were tempted, no one dared to display their true feelings for the time being. After all, Rashi was here watching them, and it would not be good to offend him. While the situation fell into a deadlock of sorts, the one who had barged in spoke again, "I've also heard that Ezra has set a quota, and will only be accepting 100 people. Once it's full, he will not be teaching anyone else." Uproar fell upon the hall. Many were no longer able to sit still after hearing these words. The number of disciples practicing the Gossamer Steps technique in the outer mountains had already surpassed 100. If others beat them to it, won't they lose this chance? The veins on Rashi's forehead twitched violently, his gaze akin to a knife as he looked towards the one who had spoken. The latter's head seemed to shrink back, before he hurriedly escaped. However, it was already too late. The hearts of the disciples inside the lecture hall had already begun to stir, no longer possible to repress. I have a stomachache, I have to go to the toilet." One of the disciples suddenly clutched his stomach, pale-faced as he stood up and began staggering towards the exit. Another equally quick-witted disciple weakly said, I'm also feeling a little unwell all of a sudden. It may be an inner injury I sustained in a practice bout yesterday. I'll be leaving first to rest. Come here, my good brother, how can you be so careless? I'll help you back to rest. The lecture hall immediately descended into chaos, all kinds of excuses flying left and right. None of the disciples dared to look at Rashi as they began to slip away one after another. In a short few minutes, the originally slightly squeezy lecture hall had become quite empty. Rashi's body trembled uncontrollably in anger as he watched the clearly acting disciples leave like a whirlwind. Did they think he was clueless? Every one of these bastards was likely rushing to Ezra the moment they stepped out the door. Elder brother, what do we do? Moshe watched everything happen with a pale face. He did not expect Ezra to be so merciless, forcing them into such a miserable state all of a sudden. Rashi tightly gritted his teeth as a sliver of regret flitted past in his eyes. If he knew Ezra would be such a huge problem, he would not have offended the latter due to some petty little squabble of Moshe's. However, he knew that there was no use regretting anything now, and his expression immediately turned ferocious. You disgusting brat, since you dare to cut off my income, don't blame me for what I will do. He had spent a great deal of effort to land this cushy job in the outer mountains. But now that everything had been ruined by Ezra Zephyr, he would not take things lying down. Or he would likely become a laughingstock if this matter spread to the inner mountains. A seemingly endless stream of outer mountain disciples rushed towards a certain mountain creek. The area around the creek was already a huge mess. Ezra stood somewhere to the rear, leaving the administrative matters to Gil Subzi and other Naren disciples who practiced Gossamer Steps, while Ash and his group also helped out where they could. After an hour, only 10 of the 100 quotas were left. It was at this moment that another wave of disciples began to swarm over, turning the place even more chaotic as they struggled to obtain the final 10 quotas. In fact, some of the disciples even began to fight. Gil's eyes spun in thought when he saw this. With a dry cough, he said, since no one is willing to give in, we'll auction off the last 10 quotas. They will go to the highest bidder, and the bidding will start at 5 spirit jade pieces a day and 15 for Shuryan disciples. He could tell that the ones who had rushed over at this time mostly composed of Shuryan disciples. These people were pretty rich, but most importantly, they had not believed Ezra earlier, hence why it had taken them so long to come. Ezra grinned at Gil's cunningness. Gil felt that he could not let these people have such an easy time, hence why he had come up with such a ruthless move. These disciples glared at Gil in anger when they heard this, evidently realizing the latter's intentions. But even if they knew, for the sake of the quotas, they could not be bothered too much at such a time. One of the Shuryan disciples quickly shouted, I bid 16 spirit jade pieces. I bid 17 pieces. Another gritted his teeth and followed. This price was already exceeding Rashi's place, but since Ezra was more effective, the price was still within an acceptable level. 18 pieces. In the end, however, there was someone even fiercer, snatching away the quota with a bid of 18 spirit jade pieces. Numerous disciples secretly wet their lips at the sight of this. 18 spirit jade pieces a day meant a total of 540 by the time one was done in a month. This was a huge, painful price. With the exception of the first quota being bidded away at a price of 18 spirit jade pieces, the other quotas stabilized at about 16 pieces. As such, a handsome sum was easily earned. Ezra chuckled inside as he watched. Gil Subzi was indeed good at ripping others off. After the auction of the last 10 quotas, Gil announced that they would no longer be accepting any more students. The numerous disciples that had yet to sign up began to sigh repeatedly, feeling disappointed inside. Only now did they regret not believing Ezra earlier. Though they were disappointed, no one tried to stir up any trouble. It was likely that after witnessing Ezra's capability, these unofficial outer mountain disciples now had some respect towards him. After all, everyone still hoped to receive guidance from him, and naturally would not dare to offend him. As such, peace finally began to slowly return to the long chaotic area around the creek. The chubby gills grinned from ear to ear as he practically sprinted over, a large sack hoisted over his back. The clear tinkling of spirit jade pieces could be heard from within, an extremely beautiful sound indeed. He allowed the sack to land with a loud thud in front of Ezra and said, "Your Majesty, everything is basically in order. Here's the fees for tomorrow, a sum of over 650 spirit jade pieces." Saliva seemed to flow down from his mouth as he spoke. This was only the first day. In a month, Ezra would have earned nearly 18,000 spirit jade pieces, an enormous sum even to the numerous official Outer Mountain disciples. Ezra could not help but sigh. It had been way too easy to earn these spirit jade pieces. With their support, he could finally squander money as he pleased. With a flick, spiritual energy wrapped around 100 pieces in the sack and sent them flying towards Gil Subzi and the rest. "You guys have worked hard today. Don't reject this tiny bit of goodwill, all of you should know that it's really nothing to me. And distribute the remaining amongst the 500 Naren continent's disciples. Pass my order that these spirit jades can only be used for blooming spirit flower to speed up your martial prowess. I want all of Naren disciples to conquer either first-class quotas or second-class quotas. If, by the time of peak selection ceremony, anyone failed to ascend and remained a measly third-class disciple after being pampered to this extent, then I will personally cut his throat and extract his soul. My spirit jades are not for free, I need results in exchange." Everyone who heard that twitched, even Ash Beckham was looking with his eyes wide opened. He is distributing that big sum to his people. The Naren disciples were worried. For others, the words of Ezra were mere hollow threats, but the Naren disciples knew that he can literally extract the soul out of them. The big powerhouses such as XYR, Zulfi, Argus, Shifa and Thur were absent. Ezra prohibited them from coming and ordered them to focus on their prowess, but the others were present and the first one to move was Tsinzutun. He came forward and knelt before Ezra. "Your Majesty, I will grab a first-class seat for myself before the peak selection." He ignited the slackening fire in others' hearts and one by one all other Naren disciples came and knelt. "That's the spirit," praised Ezra. He then looked at Ash Beckham with a smile and said, "All of you should come here again from tomorrow onwards. I will help you guys with the Gossamer Steps technique." Ash Beckham, Telhai and the rest nodded. After seeing this, Ezra did not waste any more time. He kept one sack of spirit jade and leisurely turned around, leaving the creek and heading back to his little house. The area around the creek became extremely lively during the subsequent few days. Over 100 disciples would gather here at a specific time, while numerous others also came over to observe. Ezra Zephyr would spend some time every day helping everyone knit their yarns. However, due to the number of people, it had become much more troublesome to cinch yarns even with the power of the spiritual energy, causing his efficiency to drop. Even so, he was able to maintain a speed of 1 to 2 yarns per day for everyone. Though Ezra was a little unsatisfied with this pace, the disciples that had come for his help were delighted by it, emotions and excitement often flushing their faces. After all, they would usually take quite a few days to knit a single yarn. In comparison, the rate at Ezra's place was clearly much faster. At this speed, the first level promised by Ezra would definitely be reached in a month. Hence, as the days passed, the gazes of numerous disciples seemed to burn hotter and hotter when they looked towards the prince, and there was even an additional trace of admiration now present in their eyes. Ezra Zephyr had used reality to prove his ability. After each daily training session, the elated disciples would brag about their progress to those whom had been unable to obtain a spot, causing the latter to be madly envious and so regretful that they felt as if it would be better to die. If they had believed in Ezra a little earlier, they would not be in their current predicament where even a spot was out of their grasp. At this rate, the disciples receiving guidance from Ezra Zephyr would very likely reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month. By that time, the gap between them would become clear. Those originally stronger disciples may soon be surpassed by others. Such thoughts made the many disciples who practiced the Gossamer Steps technique very anxious. Moreover, the progress at Rashi's place seemed to be growing slower and slower recently, although they still had to pay the same considerable tuition fees. Therefore, some of the disciples withdrew from Rashi's classes and began to save up spirit jade, waiting for Ezra's next round of recruitment. As such, although far more than 100 Outer Mountain disciples were practicing the Gossamer Steps technique, the disciples at Rashi's place gradually lessened. In the end, only a meager dozen disciples were left, a pretty pitiful sight indeed. Hence, while the many lectures halls in the rear mountain remained abuzz with activity, only Rashi's place appeared rather lonely and desolate. The other official Outer Mountain disciple instructors were secretly alarmed by this scene, all of them committing Ezra Zephyr's name to heart. When Ezra and Rashi clashed previously, they had naturally felt that a mere unofficial Outer Mountain disciple could not possibly be so capable. Hence, they had unhesitatingly chose to support Rashi when he asked for their help. But now, that decision of theirs did seem rather foolish. Ezra was clearly no Samaritan. Wasn't it clear already what state Rashi had fallen to after clashing with the former? As true Outer Mountain disciples, they understood what a great job it was to teach spirit techniques in the Outer Mountains, and numerous mountain disciples would fight tooth and nail for it. Rashi had paid a tremendous price to obtain this cushy job, but who could have expected things to end up like this? Ezra Zephyr should not be provoked. The sight of Rashi's lonely and desolate lecture hall made the other Outer Mountain disciple instructors sigh inside. As a result, they would occasionally sing praises about Ezra Zephyr while giving their lectures, hoping that it would eventually travel to Ezra's ears as a show of goodwill. The previous lecture ban on Ezra and his people also quietly disappeared. Rashi's fate had clearly frightened them. No one knew whether Ezra was also capable of teaching other techniques. If they pushed him too far, and he began to teach their spiritual techniques too, Rashi's case was already a prime example of what could happen. In the pavilion, Ian reached out a hand to caress the cooling spirit jade pieces as he grinned. "You're the one who best understands the proper way one should act." His cast a glance in a certain direction as he shook his head. The new kids are all full of youthful vigor, and have yet to learn the importance of the rules. Some of them gained so many benefits out of the blue, but do not know that they should give offerings to show some respect. A mocking look rose from the corners of his mouth. Rashi chuckled. The youngsters only just arrived at the spirit-devouring mountain, and do not clearly understand where they stand. They might be under the impression that they are still in the same remote continent from before, and can act as the same genius everyone flatters. That's why they are unable to understand how to behave properly. Ian nodded with a wide smile. "What do you plan on doing?" Although that brat is arrogant, truth be told, he is not breaking any of the sex rules. A smile rose from the corners of Rashi's mouth. Although there is no rule that says an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple doesn't have the right to teach, Elder Ian should not forget that there is another rule that states only one person is needed to teach one spiritual technique. Yin's eyes narrowed slightly. There is such a rule, but that kid is just an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple. Do you intend to bully him out with force? If so, people will say an official Outer Mountain disciple is bullying an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple. Rashi softly chuckled. If I wanted to use such a method, he would have stomped into the ground long ago. He looked towards Ian and said, "Didn't the kid brag that he's pretty good at the Gossamer Steps technique? I don't need to compete with him in other aspects, only the Gossamer Steps technique. The better one will naturally be the better instructor. What do you think, Elder Ian?" Ian could not help but laugh when he heard this. A competition solely based on the Gossamer Steps technique? You are pretty smart. Although it was said that Ezra had reached the first level, Rashi had been practicing the technique for 2 years. No matter how talented Ezra Zephyr was, he could not possibly surpass Rashi in less than a month, right? In addition, Rashi had chosen a spiritual technique competition. Since no offensive thing was involved, it would not be seen as bullying, and would be within the limits of acceptability if news of it were to spread. Fine, do as you please. Ian nodded. Ian was also not very fond of the upstart brat that had been causing a ruckus recently. Most importantly, the brat was completely ignorant of how the world functioned, and did not know how to show respect to one's seniors. Hence, Ian did not mind letting him learn the harsh ways of society. I will spread the word that the two of you will compete based on the Gossamer Steps technique in 5 days. Whoever wins will become the only Gossamer Steps technique instructor in the Outer Mountains. Joy finally flooded Rashi's eyes when he heard this. He lifted his head and looked in the direction of the mountain creek as chillingness and ridicule flitted across in the depths of his eyes. Ezra, oh Ezra Zephyr, if you want to fight, I have ways to toy with you to death. News that Ezra Zephyr and Rashi would compete based on spiritual technique to see who should possess the right to be an instructor of the Gossamer Steps technique very quickly spread to the entirety of the Outer Mountains. This matter undoubtedly led to a huge uproar. The sharper individuals could already see that this was Rashi's counterattack. Although everyone knew that Ezra was extremely talented in the Gossamer Steps technique, at the end of the day, he had only been practicing it for less than a month. Rashi, on the other hand, had spent nearly 2 years on it. No matter how one looked at it, a competition purely based on technique was completely in Rashi's favor. This is too shameless. Does being at a higher level in the Gossamer Steps technique means he will surely be a better teacher? Yeah, Ezra can train you to the first level in a month. Can Rashi do that? Rashi is clearly causing trouble on purpose. Countless whispers spread in the Outer Mountains, especially from the disciples that hoped to obtain Ezra's guidance, all of them of one mind as they spoke up for Ezra Zephyr. After all, training with Ezra was more effective. If Ezra's right to teach was taken, they would have no choice but to return to Rashi. An outcome that would undoubtedly waste more time and spirit jade. However, their opposition was unable to amount to anything. After all, the disciples that practiced the Gossamer Steps technique was only a little fraction in the entire Outer Mountains. Even more disciples were waiting to be entertained, especially the Shuryan disciples. Ezra's reputation had grown too great recently, making them slightly unhappy. Hence, they were naturally more than happy to watch him being suppressed by Rashi. In addition, this was a matter decided by the Outer Mountain manager, Elder Ian, so none of the disciples could object. News of the spiritual technique competition swiftly spread to this place and landed in Ezra's ears. The prince was seated on a rock, pretty much no change in his expression. However, the 100 or so disciples before him immediately burst into noise. Rashi is too much. Do we have to even ask him where we're allowed to train the Gossamer Steps technique? His place is so expensive and so inefficient, who would want to go there? Mahi also frowned slightly. She came to Ezra's side and said, Rashi's bullying is intolerable. I can't believe that he decided on this competition without notifying you or seeking your opinion. This information had only reached Ezra's ears when it was being spread. From this, one could see that Rashi clearly did not care about Ezra's opinions. Ezra heard everything. He smiled faintly. I've clearly become an eyesore to someone for quite some time. There was no way that Rashi would be able to decide on this match with just his Outer Mountain disciple status alone. Everything had to first be approved by the Outer Mountain Manger, Elder Ian. What are your plans? There was some worry in Mahi's bright eyes. Although Ezra had mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique, Rashi had reached this level long ago. Moreover, although it was not a real fight but a spiritual technique match, the odds were clearly still stacked against Ezra Zephyr. Since my opponent has thrown out this move, I will naturally have to receive it. Ezra Zephyr grinned. He knew long in advance that Rashi would never let this matter rest. His source of income had been cut off by the Werewolf Prince after all. Ezra Zephyr also understood that he needed to eliminate Rashi in order to continue earning Spirit Jade. Now that the other party had played his hand, it was undoubtedly Ezra Zephyr's best chance to remove the former. Since both of them were eyeing the Spirit Jade income from teaching the Gossamer Steps technique, one of them would naturally have to be eliminated. It was not that Ezra had not considered teaching another spiritual technique, but if he did so, he would offend even more people. He was currently only a new Outer Mountain disciple, so there was no need for him to be so greedy. Mahi rather admired the fact that there was no fear on Ezra's face, but worry still flooded her eyes. She understood that no matter how pathetic Rashi was, he was still a true outer disciple. I previously heard Rashi say that he has already knitted 41 yarns. However, he may have been hiding his true strength. Mahi and Gale told Ezra Zephyr the information she knew. Ezra Zephyr's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone as devious as him will not reveal his bottom line so easily. 41 yarns was likely just a front, or Rashi would not have so confidently fixed a spiritual technique match while clearly knowing that Ezra Zephyr had also reached the first level. It was obvious that Rashi was confident in his abilities. Rashi may have his confidence, but Ezra Zephyr too should not be looked down upon. The prince's gaze turned towards the clamoring crowd below as he said in a calm voice, "No need to be alarmed. Since Rashi wants a competition, I'll just have to accept." Upon hearing that Ezra Zephyr was going to accept the match, the numerous disciples looked to each other in dismay, seeing the worried looks in everyone's eyes as they began to speak in low voices. They were clearly afraid that Ezra Zephyr would lose, giving them no option but to return to Rashi. However, since the competition was already set in stone, their worry would not change anything. The only thing left was to nervously wait for the match in 5 days. In the following 5 days, the spiritual technique match between Ezra Zephyr and Rashi had undoubtedly become the focus of the entire Outer Mountains. It was the most popular topic for a time, drawing the attention of countless disciples. No one had expected Rashi to counterattack in such a manner. But it was undoubtedly a very smart move. If it was only a spiritual technique competition, no one could say that Rashi was using his superior might to bully Ezra. However, things were not looking good for the prince. From what everyone could see, no matter how talented Ezra was in the Gossamer Steps technique, he would not be able to match Rashi, whom had not stopped walking on this path for nearly 2 years. After all, someone who could become an official Outer Mountain disciple would not be an easy opponent. Dressed entirely in white, Drake Tubble was seated inside a stone pavilion as the surrounding spiritual energy surged over, transforming into white smoke that flowed into his body through his nose. The sound of rushing wind was heard behind him, causing Drake Tubble to open his eyes, only to find a young man in blue robes standing behind him. The youth's eyes were long and narrow, and seemed to smile all the time. But there was a blade-like feeling from his smile that made no one dare to look directly at him. The young man in blue robes was called Paul Channa and was also an influential figure amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. He was ranked 3rd amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples, losing only to Drake Tubble and Ravina in Gale. Paul grinned and said, have you heard? That guy Ezra Zephyr is going to compete with Rashi in the Gossamer Steps technique. Drake's expression remained indifferent as he said, overestimating his abilities. Paul chuckled. It seems that you have a lot of opinions about him. There was only calmness on Drake's face as he replied, he does not have the qualifications for me to have any opinions about him. However, he is very cunning. He deliberately approached Mahi in hopes of making use of her connections. And recently, even Ravina and him have been meeting far too many times. Drake's gaze lowered slightly as iciness flashed in his eyes. He truly is not tactful at all. I had warned him after all. Muttered Drake to himself. Upon hearing Drake's words, Paul grinned and said, that kid is rather unfortunate to have caught your attention. The man in blue cloths indifferently said, but it seems that there is no need for me to act. Although Rashi is only a silver belt disciple, he has still managed to enter the Outer Mountains, and even if it is only in Gossamer Steps technique match, he should still be able to steamroll that kid. Rashi doesn't really have much ability. It's been years, but he's still only a silver belt disciple. Paul Channa's tone was full of contempt towards Rashi. Drake glanced at the former. Do not underestimate him. Rashi is very cunning, and has likely concealed his abilities. He raised his head and looked towards a certain direction in the Outer Mountains as iciness and disdain appeared in his eyes. When Rashi crushes that arrogant kid, he should learn to be a little more well-behaved, right? To think that a peasant prince from this remote continent dares to steal my woman. The corners of Drake's mouth curled as he said to Paul, when the date of the match arrives, we'll also go watch the entertainment. For the next few days, the training sessions by the creek was not put on hold. Ezra Zephyr still continued to help everyone knit their yarns. The only difference was that he was spending the majority of his time immersed in his own training. By the creek, the numerous disciples often looked towards Ezra Zephyr with complicated expressions. They could sense that Ezra seemed to be trying his best to make every last second count. However, when this scene fell in their eyes, it undoubtedly made them feel that Ezra Zephyr was not confident. Hence, they could only lament continuously inside. After all, the progress while training here was just too delightful. The thought that they would lose it all in a few days only made them more depressed. After another training session ended, the numerous disciples slowly dispersed, while Mahi and Gale walked to Ezra's side and said, "Hey, you've not been looking too good these past 2 days." She could also sense that Ezra had become much more silent during the past 2 days, his entire being seemingly tensed up as if feeling an immense pressure from Rashi. The prince slowly opened his eyes and smiled somewhat helplessly. "Rashi has such a huge head start on me in the Gossamer Steps technique, of course I have to speed up my training." A hasty last-minute effort, Mahi's red lips curled downwards. She hesitated for a moment, before she said in a low voice, "How about I help out? I can find someone to transfer Rashi back to the official Outer Mountains." Her old ancestor was the master of the Heavenly Fiend Peak, someone with extremely high status. As long as he were to open his mouth, transferring an Outer Mountain disciple was like having a yawn for him. "Yeah, we can help you." Ravina and Gale arrived. Ezra was somewhat surprised as he glanced at Mahi and Ravina, unable to stop himself from grinning as he said, "Don't you hate those who go through the back door the most?" He recalled that at the very beginning, Ravina and Gale had been exceedingly unfond of him, because she had been under the impression that he had relied on his relations to become a first-class disciple. Now, this same prideful Ravina and jolly Mahi were actually willing to help him pull strings. This was something that Ezra was extremely surprised by. Mahi's pretty face involuntarily blushed when she heard this. Ravina flinched as well. Soon after, she glared daggers at Ezra as she said, "I'm only doing this out of consideration for the numerous Outer Mountain disciples who are learning the Gossamer Steps technique. Since you have the capability, you are naturally the most suitable person for this role. Why should you be replaced? Furthermore, you promised to help Mahi reach the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique. If the right to teach is stripped from you, what will she do?" Ezra began to laugh, his opinion towards Ravina growing a little more favorable. However, he waved his hand and said, "Thank you for your good intentions, but it will be best for me to resolve this matter myself." Amir Rashi did not have the qualifications to force him to rely on a girl's connections. Ravina softly snorted. "I don't give a damn about your opinion anymore, I'll ask my old ancestor to help you out. Like I said, I can't let my cousin study under that buffoon Rashi." Ezra smiled and scratched his head. "If that's the case, then, tell him to supervise the fight. Eldarine may do something to make me fail." Ravina and Mahi smiled. "Sure, we can do that much." Ezra smiled again as he scratched his head, his actions looked cute to both girls. The young man before them may seem quite straightforward and good-looking when he smiled, but the pride inside his bones did not lose to anyone else. "You'd better train hard. I do want to see how far you can push the Gossamer Steps technique during these few days." With a twist of her tiny waist, Ravina turned around, her red figure akin to an escaping bundle of fire. Contrary to her, the curvy Mahi gently turned around, using every part of her hips to walk like a surging wave of ocean. 5 days gradually passed under the expectant gazes of the many Outer Mountain disciples. On the morning of the 5th day, a ray of sunlight broke through the thick layers of clouds, shining on the unbroken mountain range. The outer mountains that had been silent for a night suddenly began to burst into activity and noise at this moment. Countless figures rose into the sky on using spiritual energy, jumping towards a certain giant mountain. Before one of the houses, a fully dressed Rashi walked out the door, where Moshi was already waiting. Moshi looked towards Rashi, who was in glowing spirits, and said, "Elder brother, we'll finally be able to resolve all of our grievances today." Rashi's expression remained unchanged, his eyes narrowing slightly as he gazed towards a certain creek in the outer mountains. In the end, a sneer of contempt appeared from the corners of his mouth as he rose into the sky with a stomp. "Let's go. After today, I'll make it such that Ezra Zephyr will no longer dare to utter the 3 words Gossamer Steps technique." A majestic, lush mountain stood amongst the mountain range of the outer mountains. Today, a seemingly endless stream of spiritual energy light figures descended from the sky at the foot of this verdant mountain, breaking its peace and serenity by filling the area with excitement and noise. Today was the day of the match between Ezra and Rashi, and the venue was this very mountain. This was why it had become the focal point of the outer mountains. After all, there had never been a competition between an unofficial outer mountain disciple and an official outer mountain disciple for so many years. Hence, even a mere spiritual technique-based match had managed to draw everyone's eyes. A dozen or so figures descended from the sky, landing just outside the Green Mountain. They immediately drew gaze after gaze filled with respect, because the one that led them was Drake Tubble, dressed in his usual white clothes. There was no one who did not know Drake Tubble's name in the outer mountains. Everyone acknowledged him as the strongest amongst this batch of unofficial outer mountain disciples. One could imagine how great his prospects were for the future even in a place like the spirit-devouring mountain. The one at Drake Tubble's side, wearing blue robes, also drew everyone's attention. The fact that Paul Channa was able to be ranked 3rd amongst the 10 great outer mountain disciples was enough to show his strength and talent. The group of them basically stood at the peak of the outer mountain disciples. Hence why numerous other mountain disciples cast respectful gazes over at their arrival. In response to this gazes, Drake's expression remained apathetic. His eyes scanned the area, eventually coming to a stop nearby. It was where Ravina in Gale, Mahi in Gale, and Natli Tum were standing shoulder to shoulder. The 3 young ladies had slender, sexy figures that could stir the soul, drawing quite a number of gazes towards them. Natli nudged Mahi's slender waist and said, "Hey, Drake is looking at us." Mahi glared at her and Ravina sent a cold gaze at Drake. Upon seeing her look over, a gentle smile appeared on the latter's cold, prideful, and handsome face. A glance was all Ravina took before withdrawing her gaze, frowning slightly as she looked towards a certain direction. The eyes of Drake were on Ravina in Gale alone. She was more talented than Mahi in Gale. With her fierce temper, her caliber rose to a higher level. Time slowly flowed as more and more disciples arrived, causing the place to turn increasingly lively. Swish swish. All of a sudden, 2 streams of light descended from the sky, landing at the foot of the mountain. The appearance of these 2 figures instantly drew countless gazes, because the one in front was one of the main actors for today, Rashi. Rashi stood with his hands behind his back, his expression indifferent. Not long after Rashi's appearance, the sound of thundering lightning was heard. The crowd watched as Ezra Zephyr flew over. Wings made of black lightning flapped from his back, shocking everyone. Behind him were 500 Naran continent disciples. Unlike him, they could only jump. From far away, they looked like an army of fleas. The prince of Bloodfang Kingdom, Ezra Zephyr, landed on the mountain. The lightning wings vanished. Now that the 2 leads were here, the atmosphere immediately heated up. A cluster of spiritual energy drifted over in the sky. Eldarine was flying on sky. He beamed as he looked towards Ezra and Rashi, an indescribable luster in his eyes as he said, "The both of you should already know that the loser of this match will lose the right to teach other disciples the Gossamer Steps technique. Do either of you have any objections?" Rashi shot an icy look at Ezra and said, "No objections." Ezra sneered in his heart. These 2 had secretly came up with this competition without informing him nor asking for his opinion. Asking such a question now was truly a joke. Hence, he merely swept a glance at Eldarine, ignoring the question. Upon seeing this, Ian chuckled softly as he secretly remarked to himself, "Arrogant brat, I'll be waiting to see you cry later." Just as Yin's voice faded, an elderly voice interjected. "I shall oversee this match. I believe it will be better for me to oversee it instead." Ian frowned, a stern gaze immediately turning towards the direction where the voice had come from. Who dares? Before he could finish, however, his words froze at his mouth. He had seen an elder in grey seated on a tree nearby, wearing a nonchalant expression. Elder Rustum. Yin's rigid face stretched to form a smile as he hurriedly cupped his hands together. Why didn't Elder inform me so I can come and receive you? The surrounding mountain forests broke out into waves of noise. Amazement in the eyes of numerous outer mountain disciples as they looked towards the elder in grey. The most senior person they had seen since coming to the outer mountains had been Elder Ian. They had of course heard that there were 2 elders in the outer mountains, but the likes of them did not have the qualifications to meet such individuals. Who could have expected one of the elders would voluntarily show himself, and even oversee the match between 2 disciples? The elder in grey glanced at Ian and said in an indifferent voice, "If I still did not appear, you might have forgotten that there's someone above you." Cold sweat appeared on Yin's head. His lips moved, but he did not dare to say anything. Elder Rustum did not elaborate in front of the numerous disciples, but merely said, "I shall oversee this match. Do you have any complaints?" Elder Ian hurriedly said, "I won't dare. Having Elder oversee the match is naturally the most fair choice." His gaze secretly swept towards Rashi below. The latter was also stunned by this turn of events, but his gaze soon flickered for a moment as he regained his cool. This kid's luck is pretty good. To think he even managed to draw out Elder Rustum. Rashi's eyes were cold. He and Elder Ian had originally planned for the latter to oversee the match, allowing him to secretly making things difficult for Ezra Zephyr such that he would have no chance at all. However, it seems that these methods could no longer be used. Even so, Rashi did not really care, because they were only one of his many contingencies. Ezra was confused. Was his luck that good? He thought. But soon after, he remembered something. He turned his head to find the red and blue beauties. His eyes halted at the sight of Ravina and Mahi. The former smiled and latter winked at him. They were the one who brought that other elder today. Ezra smiled, bowed respectfully as he asked, "Elder Rustum, how will we be competing in this match?" The other disciples curiously looked over. They too wanted to know what kind of match it would be. After all, the Gossamer Steps technique was not like offensive techniques, which could be judged based on power. Rustum softly chuckled. The essence of the Gossamer Steps technique lies in 2 areas, speed and neutralization power. Ezra gave a faint nod. The technique allowed one to make the body ethereally aerial, causing one's speed to rise to a level that ordinary people would find difficult to match. The Gossamer Steps technique also gave the ability to neutralize any force that struck the body, making these 2 aspects the essence of the technique. Hence, today's match will be based on your speed and neutralization power in the Gossamer Steps. However, I will seal Rashi's spiritual energy to 2nd level core formation for fair match. Elder Rustum gazed at the majestic green mountain before him as he suddenly took a deep breath, before abruptly blowing. Hu. The breath of spiritual energy that emerged was akin to the Milky Way. It swept through the air, completely covering the green mountain. Boundless spiritual energy whizzed about the mountain like a million astral winds, booing and hissing. A faint but enormous pressure spread from it. Everyone watched this scene in shock. A breath of spiritual energy from the elder could be said to be earth-shaking, such power was practically immeasurable. This mountain has already been enveloped by my spiritual energy. Once you enter, you will be exposed to my energy pressure, making you feel as if you are carrying a mountain on your back. Besides this, the astral winds my spiritual energy has turned into will attack you. You will be unable to avoid, and can only bear the attacks with your bodies. This will reveal how much power your gossamer body can neutralize. Rustum grinned. The numerous disciples cried out in shock when they heard this. To reach the peak, the 2 of them would have to rely on their speed while neutralizing the astral winds. It was a very appropriate test for the Gossamer Steps technique. How about it, do the 2 of you feel this is fair? Rustum looked towards Ezra and Rashi. A serious look appeared on both their faces, but they still nodded in the end. since the two of you have no objections. Rustum waved his sleeve as two paths opened at the foot of the mountain, before his voice sounded like thunder. Let the match begin. Let us see which of you is more adept at the Gossamer Steps technique. Energy astral winds wreaked havoc on the lush, green mountain, like blades made from wind as they swept past, shredding even the air to pieces. Under the countless watching gazes, Ezra Zephyr and Rashi stood at the foot of the mountain. The two looked at each other, iciness appearing in their eyes. Ezra, I admit that you have some talent. In a few more years, you will likely have a place in the spirit-devouring mountain. Rashi's eyes were ice-cold. Soon after, he let out an icy chuckle as he said, however, your mistake was to hop out now. The current you still does not have the qualifications. The prince laughed and responded, you can save these words for when you reach the peak before me. Stubborn fool. Rashi shook his head, mockery flashing in his eyes. A split second later, thundering black lightning simultaneously erupted from Ezra Zephyr, and Rashi's body released a dense green spiritual energy. The two transformed into flashes of light as they charged into the green mountain, enveloped by berserk spiritual energy. The instant they entered, Ezra and Rashi's figures paused slightly. It was due to the suppression from Elder Rustum's spiritual energy, making the air akin to a quagmire. The movement's ordinary individuals who entered would be greatly restricted, making it difficult for them to advance. Gossamer form! Shouted Ezra and Rashi. Nearly half of their figures began to gradually become gossamer under the crowd's watching gazes as their speed rapidly rose, fast as lightning. A series of gasps rang out in the vicinity of the Green Mountain, clearly shocked by the speed Ezra Zephyr and Rashi had displayed. Although the Gossamer Steps technique is only at the mid-tier Gamma layer skill, it does have its merits. Paul Channa's eyes narrowed, smiling as he observed the rapidly moving figures on the mountain. Drake's expression remained indifferent. No matter how fast they run, they will only be rabbits, still merely prey in the eyes of a real predator. Who do you think will win? Asked Paul. Drake uncaringly replied, it will depend on how much Rashi has concealed his abilities. While the two were conversing, the two figures on the mountain seemed to leave behind a trail of mist as they advanced. It was at this moment that the spiritual energy that enveloped the mountain began to rear its fangs. Spiritual energy darted forth, transforming into countless glowing windy knives. These knives seemed to cover the sky and land as they swiftly descended upon the two figures. Ezra and Rashi were unable to dodge, having no choice but to receive the attacks with their bodies. Therefore, in a short span of a dozen breaths, fresh blood began to appear on their bodies, cut after cut appearing one after another. Even so, anyone could see that Ezra and Rashi had used the gossamer parts of their bodies to receive the attacks. Although their bloody appearances looked extremely miserable, the majority of the force had been neutralized by the Gossamer Steps technique. From start to end, their figures were neck to neck. In the short span of a few minutes, the duo had already reached the halfway point. Even till now, however, both parties were still equal. Rashi's gaze swept across Ezra from the corner of his eyes. Soon after, iciness flashes in his eyes as the corners of his lips lifted slightly. It's time to show you the difference between us. With a thought, the yarns in his body instantly lit up. In a short few breaths, the number of yarns in his body rose from 30 plus to 45. He had clearly began to reveal his hidden strength. As more and more yarns were knitted, everyone saw Rashi's body grow more and more gossamer as faint mists began to spread around it. Whoosh! His speed soared, overtaking Ezra Zephyr in a single breath. His body met the innumerable spiritual energy knives head-on as he rocketed towards the peak. Rashi's sudden explosion of speed instantly drew numerous gasps from the surroundings of the mountain. As expected, he has concealed his strength. Numerous disciples sighed in amazement. They could naturally sense that Rashi's Gossamer Steps had grown even more formidable. Mahi's hands began to clench tightly, her teeth biting into her red lips as she stared at the figure that had fallen behind. Natalie could not help but remark from the side, it's over for him, Mahi. Rashi's mastery of the ethereal form is much greater than Ezra's. Shut up, he will win," retorted Ravina. From the looks of it, Ezra's first-level mastery was practically unable to compare to Rashi. Mahi did not speak, merely continuing to stare. She believed that Ezra would not lose so easily. Natalie also silenced herself, in order to not piss Ravina off. Somewhere else, XYR, Zulfi, Gil, Ash Beckham and the rest anxiously watched the widening gap between the two individuals of the mountain, their eyes filled with worry. "Master," mumbled XYR. But there was nothing they could do besides sending out prayer after prayer in their hearts. "You were so arrogant previously, but you shall now have a taste of what it feels like to eat a rotten fruit." There was a look of ecstasy mixed with excitement in Moshe's eyes when he saw this. Soon after, he began to laugh. Sighs rang out in the vicinity of the mountain, pained looks on the faces of the disciples that practiced the Gossamer Steps technique. Even more disciples, however, were enjoying the show, happy to see Ezra being suppressed. After all, if Ezra performed too outstandingly, the rest of them would appear useless in comparison. Their loud laughter calmed down when they sensed killing intents directed towards them. The murdering intent was released by Bloodfang's martial masters. Elder Rustum sat on a tree as he looked towards the now leaving Rashi, before turning to Ezra. The former's eyes suddenly squinted as he mumbled, "The yarns in this kid's body. From the looks of it, he would never be able to catch up." Numerous disciples shook their heads and sighed. As expected, there was no point to this match at all. No matter how talented Ezra was, he had only been learning the Gossamer Steps technique for a month. What about Rashi? Nearly 2 years. However, there were some sharper disciples that suddenly remarked in uncertainty, Ezra Zephyr's speed seems to be getting faster and faster." The moment these words were heard, the crow began to closely observe. Sure enough, they discovered that Ezra's speed was rising little by little. Although it was not as explosive as Rashi's earlier burst, the increase was extremely stable. "The yarns in his body are being knitted one by one," said someone in shock. They could just barely make out dots of light appearing and linking one after another on Ezra's body. Such a sight was not foreign to those who practiced the Gossamer Steps technique. It was an indication that a yarn had been knitted. Elder Rustum let out an amused chuckle when he saw this. His perceptive abilities were naturally extraordinary, and had managed to discover the truth with a single look. Ezra's yarns were likely already knitted by him, but had not been properly linked up due to the lack of time. As such, when his spiritual energy began to circulate, the yarns would be connected one by one. SWWIISSH. Under the countless astonished gazes, more and more light dots appeared on Ezra's body, while his speed also grew faster and faster. Wind began to surge around him, as if was riding on a cloud. Every gaze was tightly fixed on the faintly discernible light dots on Ezra's body. Each one represented a newly linked yarn. "There's already 43 yarns," gasps would sound out from time to time, the numerous disciples stupefied. No one had expected Ezra's mastery to have also reached such a high level. Moreover, the yarn's light dots were still increasing. After a dozen breaths, it reached 48. A number that had already surpassed Rashi. Hence, a large portion of Ezra's body began to gossamer, faint wind spreading from within as his speed soared to the limits. The countless astral wind knives that shot towards him ending up passing straight through his body, only leaving behind tiny sprinkles of blood. Ezra's figure once again appeared a dozen or so feet behind Rashi, rapidly catching up. "Wow!" Countless cries of amazement rang out in the surroundings of the mountain. No one had imagined that Ezra would really catch up. God damn it! Rashi was naturally able to detect the piercing sound of rushing wind behind him. A gaze swept to his back from the corner of his eye, fury appearing within his eyes when he saw the rapidly approaching Ezra. Rashi took in a deep breath as he made a seal with one hand. One could only watch as yarns also began to light up on his body. "Ezra, did you believe that 45 yarns is my limit?" With a low howl, the dot after dot began to light up on his body. It was obvious that Rashi had been forced to use his full power. 2 figures bolted up the mountain like lightning, while also appearing akin to 2 clouds. Many disciples could only barely make out the two blurry figures within. Everyone's eyes were wide open, watching the race without blinking. Rashi's yarns has already reached 54. Ezra Zephyr's has also risen above 50. This is way too crazy. Countless whispers emerged. Shock was apparent on everyone's faces as they watched the two figures persistently nipped at each other's heels. Only a third of the distance was left to the peak. No one had expected such a neck-to-neck race. Rashi's lead had already been forcibly taken back inch by Ezra. Rashi's expression turned extremely dark and stormy at this moment. Ezra's stubbornness had already exceeded his expectations. All 58 of my yarns are already released, a strength that I have concealed for a long time. It had originally been for the sake of stealing the limelight during the 7-peak martial meet, so I never imagined that my hand would be forced today. Rashi violently gritted his teeth. Most importantly, even his full power was unable to crush Ezra Zephyr. Instead, it was as if he was tenaciously holding on to the former's tail. Ezra, you forced me to do this. No matter how great of a price I'll have to pay, I will crush you beneath my heel. Rashi knew that he would definitely be mocked if he lost to Ezra and returned to the mountains. Hence, the former had to grab victory at any cost. A resolute look appeared in Rashi's eyes. With a deep breath, a scarlet pill was rolled out from under his tongue, before being swallowed into his stomach. Once the scarlet pill entered Rashi's stomach, a surge of heat exploded from within it, like magma, as it frantically flowed through his channels. This pill was known as the Energy Boost Pill and was said to have the effect of temporarily raising the power of one's spiritual techniques. There were some negative repercussions, however, though the current Rashi clearly could not be bothered by such things to achieve victory. He knew that he would likely lose all face if he lost to Ezra here. Therefore, he absolutely could not lose. Scarlet red surfaced in Rashi's eyes as an evil look flashed within them. In the next instant, his speed abruptly soared, a flash of red faintly visible in the mist swirling around his body. In a short few minutes, he had widened the lead once again. With the Energy Boost Pill, Rashi's speed was now comparable to the Gossamer Steps technique with over 60 yarns knitted. An uproar once again swept through the surroundings of the Green Mountain, everyone stunned by Rashi's sudden explosion of speed. No one had expected him to have concealed his abilities so deeply. It's truly hopeless now, the crowd shook their heads. Rashi's explosion of speed this time was just too frightening. His figure had practically become wind, the sky full of astral wind knives, unable to stop him for even a split second. This level of mastery was already fast approaching the second level. Natalie's mouth hung wide open as she involuntarily muttered, "Has Rashi's mastery already reached such heights?" Ravina frowned deeply, somewhat uncertain. Although she had felt that Rashi was hiding his abilities, had he really hidden them to such an extent? The current level of Rashi's Gossamer Steps was already very close to the second level. The situation did indeed look extremely bad for Ezra Zephyr. Why does it suddenly seem as if Rashi is on steroids? Yelled Ash Beckham, his eyes filled with worry. Just as Ezra had been about to surpass Rashi, the latter suddenly released another burst of speed. Moreover, the sharp acceleration this time was basically despairing. Telhai sighed regretfully. It has not been easy for Brother Ezra to reach this level. He's only spent so much time on the Gossamer Steps technique after all. If he had more time, reaching the second level would have been just around the corner. Nearby, Shui's eyebrows also knitted together slightly when she saw the scene. On the tree, Elder Rustum's indifferent gaze merely swept off Rashi as a bright light fitted past the depths of his eyes, clearly detecting something. His hand began to rise, and just as he was intending to speak, he suddenly let out a soft cry of surprise. His gaze was currently looking towards Ezra Zephyr, who had now been left far behind, as a look of interest appeared in his eyes. At this very moment, he could sense that the spiritual energy in Ezra's body had begun to ripple violently. Evidently, the prince did not intend to give up just because Rashi had suddenly rocketed ahead. On the mountain, Ezra's figure was akin to lightning. No panic appeared on his face as he gazed at the figure to his front that was rapidly pulling ahead. Instead, he took in a deep breath of cold air. Invisible power shuddered around Ezra Zephyr's body, seemingly whipping up a storm. In that very instant, the prince suddenly felt his senses grow even sharper, all things around him appearing even clearer than before, while also allowing him to better see their source. Even the wind-wrapped Rashi to his front was now within the range of his senses. The prince could feel a tiny flash of scarlet-red light in the wind surrounding Rashi, faintly pulsing in a berserk manner. So that's what happened. Iciness flooded Ezra's eyes. Rashi's sudden burst in speed was likely due to some kind of pill that had forcibly strengthened the Gossamer Steps technique. Did something awaken in me? Ezra's eyes were clear and calm, but this was not the time for him to discover the wonders of the unknown power. With a thought, a surge of power came into his mind. Dracul-Wolf bloodline. A low shout sounded in Ezra's heart as the ancient bloodline slowly began to morph his body. His body turned into a werewolf form, taller and more profound than before. A peculiar power abruptly erupted, immediately giving him a clear view of his surroundings. What? Look at him. A werewolf, he was a werewolf? Numerous voices resounded around the Green Mountain. Under the probing of the ancient bloodline, the prince could faintly see dot after dot of light suddenly begins to emerge. There were a total of 14 light dots. Currently, 58 yarns had already been knitted in Ezra's body. If these 14 were added, it just nicely added up to 72. 72 knitted yarns meant that one had truly stepped into the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique. Although it would be safer to knit them one by one, it seems that I have no choice but to do them all at one go, mumbled Ezra to himself. The black lightning spiritual energy in his body began to churn violently, eventually whizzing through his channels as it charged towards the 14 yarns in succession. Yarns were easily knitted wherever his spiritual energy passed. All 14 yarns were threaded together by spiritual energy in a short few breaths. 72 yarns were now completely knitted. Although the 14 new yarns had yet to be polished and infused with wind essence, Ezra's Gossamer Steps technique had now just barely reached the second level. And this was already enough. The prince raised his gaze, looking towards the figure that was zooming towards the peak, as a certain angle slowly rose from the corners of his mouth. Dear Rashi, I'll show you what the true second level looks like. With a stomp of his foot, the space around him shook. Awoo! Countless gazes in the vicinity of the mountain looked over in shock and astonishment. Ezra's body was gradually turned gossamer, seemingly transforming into a figure made from the wind. At the Green Mountain, gazes were stuck on Ezra Zephyr. At a cursory glance, one would only be able to see a blurry silhouette. A storm of noise immediately exploded. What? Ezra Zephyr's entire body has become gossamer? How can that be? One needs to be at the second level to achieve that state. Although it's quite impossible, the facts are staring right at us. My God. Overwhelmed voices sounded one after another, everyone completely stupefied as they gazed upon the fully wind-like figure. Natalie had covered her mouth with her hands, shock coloring her entire face. Beside her, Mahi's eyes flickered with a resplendent light as emotion surged in her heart. Meanwhile, Ravina faintly smiled. His Majesty is awesome, uttered a dazed Gil Subzi. Ash Beckham also swallowed time and time again. This guy, Paul Channa's expression had turned rather serious. Next to him, although Drake did not say anything, his eyes narrowed slightly. The current red werewolf gave him a huge feeling of danger. Under the countless shocked gazes across the area, Ezra's body fully turned gossamer. His toes pushed off the ground as he transformed into a blurry figure that shot forward at an astonishing speed. Swish. Every gaze in the area was focused on a single thing. Ezra Zephyr fully gossamer figure shot forth like a shadow as a seemingly entire sky's worth of spiritual energy knives continuously swept past his body. This time, however, the knives seemed to be piercing through wind, unable to amount to much of a hindrance or do any harm to Ezra Zephyr. The second level of the Gossamer Steps technique allowed Ezra's body to turn completely gossamer. He was now akin to a gale of wind, ungraspable and formless. His speed had also risen to an alarming level. Numerous disciples could only see a blur shoot past, unable to make out Ezra's figure. In the short span of a dozen minutes, the gap between Ezra and Rashi rapidly shrunk. The activity from behind was also detected by Rashi at this moment. His gaze swept back, only to be scared stuff, horror and disbelief filling his eyes. What? A martial animal, Elder Rustum, there is a martial animal in Green Mountain. Rustum coldly retorted. Open your eyes and take a good look again. It was then that Rashi realized that the red-looking werewolf was none other than Ezra Zephyr. How is this possible? How can his body fully become Gossamer? Howls of terror and shock rang out in Rashi's heart. How could it not know that the full Gossamer body was a mark of stepping into the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique? Which was to say, Ezra had already knitted 72 yarns. But how could this be? How long had Ezra practiced the Gossamer Steps technique? Was his talent really at such a monstrous level? Although Rashi had borrowed the power of the energy boost pill to forcibly raise the level of his Gossamer Steps technique, it was for one only temporarily. Second, it had only allowed him to come very close to the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique. There was still a gap between this and the true second level. Rashi's face began to warp and distort, evidently overwhelmed by this information. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. It must be some kind of trick, held Rashi in his heart. The spiritual energy in his body quickly began to circulate even faster, pouring all of its power into the Gossamer Steps technique as he frantically dashed towards the peak. The peak was almost within reach, and he had to reach it first at any cost. If not, he would surely become a laughingstock. Rashi became quicker and quicker, as if squeezing out every ounce of his potential, as he headed straight towards the peak. When the numerous gazes saw that Rashi was about to reach the peak, their hearts leapt to their throats, clearly very anxious. I'm going to win. As long as I reach the peak first, I will have won this match. Rashi's eyes were tightly glued to the rapidly approaching peak. At this current time, nothing else could enter his eyes. The peak grew closer and closer. 100 feet, 60 feet, 30 feet, 10 feet. An almost crazed smile slowly began to emerge from the corners of his lips as the tree at the peak was reflected in his eyes. No matter what happened, he would be able to take everything back as long as he won this match. So what if you have insane talent? I'm the one who will be winning this match. However, when he was only a few feet from the peak, he suddenly heard the piercing sound of rushing wind behind him. The corners of his eyes twitched as his gaze swept to his back, causing his entire body to turn cold as he saw a blurry red werewolf figure rapidly approach from behind as if riding on a cloud. In the end, the figure brushed past him in a single step. Their gazes seemed to meet at that very moment. However, Rashi's was filled with terror, while Ezra's remained chilly, not even the slightest ripple to be seen. "No!" A cry of misery erupted from Rashi's mouth. But Ezra's gossamer figure had already taken the next step, reaching the peak of the majestic verdant mountain as countless gasps and cries sounded. At the peak was a giant boulder on which Ezra Zephyr now stood. His gossamer body gradually returned to normal as he looked down from above, his werewolf form turned back to humanoid form, the view of the countless figures dotting the surroundings of the mountain entering his eyes. The instant Ezra Zephyr stood on the peak, Rashi's body stiffened. He stood there, merely a few feet from the prince, a dull look in his eyes, and his face deathly pale. He never imagined that he would actually lose. In the air, Elder Yin's expression had also turned a little ugly in this scene. The corners of his mouth twitched as he cursed inside, useless trash. This outcome had also exceeded his expectations. The vicinity of the mountain was silent for an instant before cries of surprise swept across the sky and land. Stunned looks could be seen on every disciple. They too had not expected the ultimate winner to be Ezra Zephyr. An unofficial Outer Mountain disciple had beaten an official Outer Mountain disciple in a spiritual technique match. This was something that had never happened before in the spirit-devouring mountain. The sight of the young figure that stood atop the peak made even the proud Shriyan disciple click their tongues in wonder at this moment. Although they were somewhat unwilling to accept it, the young man from this remote continent had indeed obtained a beautiful victory today. Wow, this guy is a little too amazing. Natalie Tum's hands were cupping her pretty face, a tiny trace of admiration in her watery eyes as she dazedly stared at Ezra Zephyr's figure. After all, they clearly understood how difficult it was to win as an unofficial mountain disciple even in a spiritual technique match. Mahi and Gale's snow-white chin nodded faintly, a slight smile flowing out from the corners of her lips. Ezra Zephyr's performance was indeed breathtaking. On the huge tree, Elder Rustum stood up and moved, appearing directly at the peak. His gaze swept across the deathly pale Rashi as he announced, "The winner of this match is Ezra Zephyr. From today onwards, Ezra Zephyr will have the right to teach the Gossamer Steps technique, while Rashi will be stripped of his Gossamer Steps technique instructor status. You shall return to the official Outer Mountains tomorrow." Rustum looked towards Rashi and indifferently said, "Besides this, you broke the rules during the match, so make sure to receive your punishment at the disciplinary hall." He had obviously caught Rashi using a pill during the match. Rashi's body shook as his complexion paled even further. In the end, his legs turned to jelly as he crumpled to the ground. He never imagined that he would face such a complete defeat this time. As Rustum's voice sounded across the mountains, numerous cheers began to erupt from the surroundings. The disciples that were hoping to receive tutelage from Ezra even more excited and elated. The other disciples sighed inside. Ezra Zephyr was going to become famous after this match. It was likely that no one in the entire Outer Mountains would continue to look down on him. Paul Channa looked towards Ezra with interest as he listened to the cheers that filled the skies. Soon after, he sighed and said, "He does have some ability. If it were a real fight, his speed will be rather troublesome." Drake's expression remained indifferent. He looked towards Ravenna in Gale below, and just happened to catch sight of her looking at Ezra Zephyr's figure with a smile. The former's expression immediately sunk a little. He had used numerous methods in an attempt to deepen their relationship, but there was ultimately no progress. Ravenna did not seem to have any feelings for him. Although he did not know whether Ravenna was really interested in Ezra, Drake Tubble did not like this attitude she had towards him, because Drake himself had never experienced the same thing before. Drake Tubble raised his head, looking towards the figure on the peak as his expression darkened slightly. "Lowly Werewolf, there are certain things that someone like you does not have the right to even think about. The most important thing for anyone is to know one's place. You had best not provoke me." The curtains had finally closed on the spiritual technique match. However, the resultant excitement bathed the entire Outer Mountains for the subsequent few days. After this feat, Ezra's name was now well known in the Outer Mountains. Although many disciples had heard of him at the very beginning, the impression they had was one of mockery and disdain towards him, merely assuming he was a first-class disciple that had taken the back door in. Now however, there was no longer contempt in one's tone when one talked about Ezra Zephyr, because that contempt had been replaced by admiration. After all, not just anyone could achieve the feat of winning an official Outer Mountain disciple in a spiritual technique match. After that day, there were busybodies that began to dispute the Outer Mountain disciple rankings. All of them felt that Ezra Zephyr's strength would be able to enter the top 5. The reason why he was not ranked higher was because the Gossamer Steps technique highly specialized in speed, while his martial prowess was only at the second-level core formation. If he were to fight against the higher-ranked Outer Mountain disciples, everyone felt that Ezra Zephyr may not be able to win. On the other hand, if Ezra Zephyr had faced and won against Rashi in a real battle, it was likely that no one would object even if he was ranked first amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. Even so, Ezra Zephyr was now already in existence that could not be ignored in the Outer Mountains. Since Rashi had already been sent back to the Inner Mountain, the lecture hall he originally used was now empty. Hence, Elder Rustum allocated the hall to Ezra Zephy, giving him permission to teach disciples here. The lecture hall was currently almost bursting with people. Ezra Zephyr sat at the center, the black lightning extended from his body, wrapping around the wrist of every disciple. The numerous disciples present wore respectful and solemn looks on their faces. Although there were many people inside, it was peaceful and silent. Ezra Zephyr's eyes were closed, his senses reaching out through the black lightning as the spiritual energy within his body twinkled. Ever since Ezra has awakened his bloodline, it had become much easier for him to sense the yarns of others, and he no longer felt as exhausted as before. Likewise, his sensing effectiveness had also grown. Ezra's eyes had been shut for a long time. At a certain moment, they suddenly opened as he began directing the spiritual energy in the many disciples' bodies, sending it charging towards a certain spot in their bodies. A faint noise rang out as joy surfaced on the numerous disciples' faces. Everyone had clearly felt a yarn being knitted in their bodies. A wave of happiness washed over the lecture hall. Ezra waved his hand. Today's session shall end here. All of you should polish and complete your newly knitted yarns after leaving. The numerous disciples rose upon hearing this, respectfully cupping their hands together at Ezra Zephyr, before leaving one after another with excited expressions. The prince stretched his back, easing the tension between his bones. Giving guidance every day was a dry and boring task, and he definitely would not do it if not for the spirit jade. Most importantly, it was cutting into his own training time. Hence why he had yet to complete the 14 yarns he had knitted in the match with Rashi. The disciples scattered, leaving only a single pretty figure behind. It was naturally Nightingale. She grinned widely as she gazed at Ezra Zephyr and said, "Hey, everyone else has knitted in yarn today, but there's nothing on my end." Ezra Zephyr shot a helpless look at her. "You've already reached the first level, it's only natural that sensing your yarns is more difficult." Mahi had fully completed 36 yarns 2 days ago, allowing her to reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. However, she was clearly unsatisfied with this result, hence wanting to continue onwards to the second level under Ezra's guidance. Mahi pitifully looked towards the prince. "But you promised me. Stop faking it." Ezra Zephyr shook his head in an annoyed manner. Someone like Nightingale was clearly unable to pull off a convincing pitiful act. Mahi glared at him, before she placed her hands on her hips and pretended to be fierce. "Boy, if you dare to break your promise, just wait and see how I'll punish you." Towards the end, she could not help but break out into a smile. The prince sighed. He really could not be bothered with her antics. He stood up and walked towards the exit as he said, "I'll give you some special service later, I really can't afford to offend you after all." Nightingale was indeed pretty talented, and had a powerful background. She would definitely become a core member of the spirit-devouring mountain in the future, plus her character was not bad. Therefore, the prince did not mind having her as a friend. Only then did Mahi let out a soft, satisfied laugh. The corners of her lips could not help but raise slightly at the sight of Ezra Zephyr's helpless appearance. Though he was ferocious and ruthless in battle, he was very easygoing most of the time. Or that's what she thought. "I'll be making a trip to the Mystic Demon Library to borrow a spiritual technique," he said and left in hurry. Ezra Zephyr began to head towards the Mystic Demon Library, his goal this time obviously the high-tier Gamma Layer skill, 8 Lost Dragons, that he had been eyeing for so long. After reaching the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique, Ezra could clearly feel his rate of progress take a rather sharp dip. Even with the aid of the Drackle Wolf family, he would need a long time to reach the third level. Hence, it just so happened that Ezra Zephy now had time to spare to learn the 8 Lost Dragons. It was almost 2 months since they arrived at the spirit-devouring mountain, and only a single month was left till the peak selection ceremony. It was said that only the top 10 disciples would gain the right to choose their peaks. Therefore, Ezra needed to ensure he was part of this top 10 group, so that he can set the best path for himself. "I'll accompany you." Nightingale skipped towards him with her hands behind her back. The duo passed through the rear mountain, and entered the Mystic Demon Library. Ezra's objective was clear, heading directly towards the 8 Lost Dragons. The 8 Lost Dragons jade strip was still hovering in the same spot, no indication of anyone touching it. This was because top-level martial techniques were much pricier than their counterparts, so very few disciples would come to select the 8 lost dragons. Borrowing it once cost 600 spirit jade pieces. The prince involuntarily wet his lips when he saw the price. It was much higher than the Gossamer Steps technique. If not for the tidy income he received from giving guidance on the Gossamer Steps technique, he would not be able to afford it. The prince's gaze filled with burning excitement as he grasped the jade strip. In contrast to the speed-based Gossamer Steps technique, the 8 Lost Dragons was a pure attack-type technique that boasted astonishing power. If he mastered it, it would definitely be a huge boost his battle power. You really know how to choose. It's said that this 8 Lost Dragons is extremely powerful, but is also very difficult to learn. Even amongst the inner mountain disciples, there are not many who practice this technique. It was the voice of Ravenna and Gale. Mahi was somewhat surprised by Ezra's choice. The prince smirked at Ravenna, but did not say anything, grabbing the jade strip instead as he prepared to register his loan. The trio laughed and chatted as they proceeded to the counter, when Ezra's footsteps paused all of a sudden. He had seen a figure dressed entirely in white that brimmed with confidence and elegance. It was Drake Tubble. He also seemed to be here to select a spiritual technique. Upon hearing the activity behind him, he turned slightly and saw the Ezra Zephyr walking together with Mahi and Gale and his dream girl Ravenna and Gale. The hand grasping the jade strip seemed to tighten substantially. His eyes narrowed slightly before he displayed a warm smile towards Ravenna and Gale. Ravenna frowned slightly, but she still gave him a small nod. Drake's gaze did not even once look towards Ezra. The former withdrew his gaze, received the now recorded jade strip and walked out of the Mystic Demon Library. Ezra could feel that Drake was purposely ignoring him, but he did not display any unhappiness. His expression remained ordinary as he walked forward and handed the 8 Lost Dragons jade strip to the middle-aged man behind the counter. The middle-aged man was clearly somewhat surprised that he wanted to borrow the 8 Lost Dragons, but the former still helped him record it down. After keeping the jade strip, Ezra and Gale's sisters left the Mystic Demon Library. The two had already arranged the evening training venue, hence, they each left in their respective directions. The prince leisurely walked on the mountain path when his footsteps suddenly stopped. His gaze looked to his front, where a figure dressed in white was standing with his hand behind his back. Who else could it be but Drake? Drake slowly turned around, a fear-inducing iciness spreading from his usually indifferent eyes. He stared at Ezra Zephyr as a faint voice echoed across the mountain path. Ezra did winning an official outer mountain disciple in a spiritual technique match give you the courage to think that you can now trample over me? Ezra frowned as he looked towards his front where Drake stood with a hand behind his back, eyes suffused with iciness as he stared at the former. Although there was not much apparent disdain in Drake's eyes, Ezra could feel an arrogance that transcended everyone else, the way he looked at others always containing contempt. A gaze like this was even more detestable than disdain that one showed on the face, because it meant that no matter what you did, he would always feel that he is better than you. Therefore, the prince slowly said, "First things first, you and I have never even talked before this. As for trampling over you, I have zero interest, because I don't feel that there's anything great about it. I'm not the type to stir up trouble, so I hope that trouble does not come knocking at my door either. But if some opinionated fellow voluntarily sticks his head out, I wouldn't mind stepping on his head for a bit. So can you step aside and let me pass?" A faint, sharp light was present in his scarlet eyes as he stared at Drake. Drake Tubble was stunned, seemingly unable to comprehend that Ezra would not only show no fear, but instead so directly come at him with such sharp, stinging words. A dark look rose within Drake's already cold eyes. He stared at Ezra and pondered for a brief moment, before asking, "What exactly is it that makes you think you can speak in such a manner to me? Is it because you won against an official mountain disciple in a spiritual technique match?" Drake slowly walked forward, standing right in front of Ezra, the two now mere feet apart. Ezra's youthful, impassive face was reflected in the Drake cold eyes as he softly said, "Ezra, you may have been able to ride roughshod over everyone in this tiny continent you came from, fully enjoying the status of a genius, but you need to recognize exactly where you are now. This is spirit-devouring mountain, where Shurian continent rules. The one who stands before you comes from the Shurian's Tubble clan. My clan is of noble lineage in the Shurian continent, a level that you probably do not even know of. I have a senior that is an elder in the Blood Slaughterer Peak, and an elder sister in my clan is the personal disciple of the Blood Slaughterer Peak master. Drake stared at Ezra in interest. Every word that was spat from his mouth seemed to bring with it an indescribable pressure. He obviously wanted to show that his background and relations from far from anything in no good Ezra could compare to. If it was any other ordinary disciple, hearing Drake's words would likely give rise to fear in his heart. Unfortunately, Ezra's eyes remained calm from start to end, not even the slightest ripple to be seen. Seeing no response of any sort from Ezra Zephyr, Drake seemed to believe that the former was stunned and awed. An almost undetectable curve slowly lifted from the corners of his lips as he reached out a hand to gently pat Ezra's face. So can I ask you to keep your distance from Ravina and Gale? You can enjoy with Mahi, just stay away from Ravina, can you do that? When it was mere inches from Ezra's face, Drake's hand was grabbed by Ezra's. The princess stared at Drake, frowning as he said, I originally believed that you should at least have some ability as the person recognized as number one in the Outer Mountains. I never expected that you would be so pathetic. What did you say? Drake's eyes darkened. As Ezra grabbed the former's hand, he shook his head and said, if you had talked about your own capabilities, I would have at least given a little recognition. But you ended up parading all of so-called background and relations. So what if your clan is powerful? Can it control the spirit-devouring mountain? If it could, why would you need to say so much nonsense? You could have just kicked me out long ago. That's why, your so-called background has no effect on me. Disdain slowly rose from the corners of Ezra's mouth as he gazed at the cold expression on Drake's face and said, Listen boy, Mahi is only practicing the Gossamer Steps technique with me. AMD Ravina comes to check on her. If you can change her mind about it, feel free to go find her. As for me, since I've accepted her tuition fees, I will definitely teach her if she comes. And if she comes, she'll bring Ravina along as well. With regards to what you think, I don't have the tiniest bit of interest. If you really intend to do something, go ahead and take action. There's no need for you to put on an act and come warn me time and time again. As for your so-called background, if you are really able to beg for their help, feel free to. Every word from Ezra made Drake's expression turn a little stormier and darker. By the time the final word was said, a storm was already long brewing on his handsome face. The prince's blunt words had made Drake feel extremely humiliated. He could not understand why a lowly person without any background at all would dare to speak in such a manner towards him. I had originally intended to use the common people methods of people like Moshi and Rashi to make you understand that you should back off, but from what I can see, someone like you will only cry upon seeing the coffin. You filthy werewolf, since you want to die, I will grant your wish. Drake's eyes turned terrifyingly cold. A split second later, berserk and ferocious spiritual energy violently exploded from his body. I wonder what kind of punishment I'll receive after I beat you to death today. The ground below his feet cracked open at this moment. Drake's 5 fingers turned into a fist as he sent a punch flying. Space around it distorted slightly as robust spiritual energy surged, like thunder as it swung straight towards Ezra's chest. Ezra smiled slightly, his body immediately turned gossamer as he drifted back like wind. Drake's punch may have been akin to a sudden and violent storm, but Ezra Zephyr was long prepared for it. With the Gossamer Steps, he completely avoided all the punch winds. However, there were still punch winds that ignored space and surged towards him. I'll teach you today that no matter how fast you can run, you're ultimately only a rabbit to be hunted. Drake's expression was eerily cold. The tip of his foot pushed off the ground, his speed rapidly soaring as he pounced at Ezra. Berserk spiritual energy continuously erupted from his body, felling many giant trees in the vicinity. The prince coldly grinned as he gazed at Drake, who was about to use his full power. Energy also exploded from the former's body, black bolts of lightning dashing out from the top of his body, faintly forming the silhouette of a giant black wolf above. Drake, you'd better stop, you bastard. However, a sudden rage-filled shout suddenly rang out the moment Drake charged forward as a fiery red whip descended from the sky, viciously flicking towards him. Zap-pock. The air cracked under the whip. Drake's figure paused for a moment, before he drifted backwards. He raised his head, only to see Ravina in Gale standing on a nearby boulder with a fuming look on her pretty face. Flames burned on the scarlet-red whip in her hand, melting the ground around her. On the mountain. Ravina in Gale's voice was fierce and stern. Drake, if you keep trying such things behind my back, I will not easily let you off even if our families have some ties. Drake frowned and indifferently replied. Ravina, it's just a quarrel between me and him. As a fellow disciple, I should teach him how to act properly. If I don't, given Brother Ezra's attitude, he will draw even more trouble to him in the future. However, he shook his head, knowing that there was no longer anything he could do to Ezra Zephyr today now that Ravina was here. Soon after, Mahi came as well. The lightning spiritual energy around Ezra gradually withdrew as Drake frostily looked towards Ezra and said in a voice that only the two of them could hear, "You commoner cretin, she may be able to protect you now, but she can't protect you forever. Since you're so unyielding, I'll make sure to properly play with you. But you must be careful not to meet your maker so soon, entertain me for a bit." After the final word, Drake turned around and left. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the former leave. A dangerous light flickered within his eyes as he said, "Shut your damn mouth, you degenerate delusional dog's-hit dunce. You are not but a dullard, your groundbreaking arrogance sets an unreachable standard for countless generations of delusional fools. I wasn't joking with you either. If you do decide to stick out your head, then I will step on it. And when I say this shit, I really mean it." Drake's eyes turned red, and his body shook in anger, but he took a glance at Ravina and moved away. The hostile atmosphere on the mountain path faded following Drake's departure as the churning spiritual gradually calmed down. Mahi flew to Ezra Zephyr's side. She bit her red lips as she watched Drake leave, before looking towards Ezra Zephyr with an apology in her eyes. How could she not know that she was the reason why Drake Tubble had attacked Ezra Zephyr? If she had not practiced the Gossamer Steps technique with Ezra Zephyr, Drake would not be hostile towards the former. The prince smiled at Mahi as he waved his hand. Our characters conflict with each other. Even with you out of the picture, a clash will likely be unavoidable in the future. Drake was just too damned arrogant, believing himself far superior to others. He may appear uncaring and nonchalant on the surface, but the truth was that he looked down on everyone else, and even more so the Nantrian disciples. Many disciples would show a lower posture when they encountered Drake, but this was something Ezra Zephyr could not do. In addition, although he was not someone that constantly seeked out trouble, he did have his own sharp edge. Once Ezra and Drake came into contact, the two would be akin to two needles, making the other uncomfortable. Therefore, Ezra felt that even without Mahi or Ravina, a conflict would easily arise between him and Drake Tubble. However, Mahi took it as if Ezra was only consoling her. Don't worry, although Drake does have some powerful and influential people behind him if he dares to deal with you through them, I will not just stand by and watch. Ezra chuckled and said, he only brought them up to intimidate me. Given his proud character, it would be humiliating for him to seek their help just to deal with me. Ravina gave a slight nod of agreement. Mahi hesitated somewhat, before she asked, then will I still be able to learn the Gossamer Steps technique with you? She was not someone who liked to implicate others, but without Ezra's aid, a lot more time and effort would be needed for her to reach the second level of the Gossamer Steps technique. The prince laughed softly before he responded, I just said earlier that as long as you're willing to come, I'll be willing to teach. No one can change my mind. He did indeed hope to create ties with Mahi. After all, it was no good to only offend others, allies were also very important. Mahi's eyes seemed to give off a happy glow. Ezra's decision to continue guiding her also meant that he was ignoring the pressure from Drake. From a certain point of view, it meant that Ezra had chosen her over Drake. However, she would not let Ezra Zephyr bear the pressure from Drake. Ezra, if Drake tries anything funny, feel free to come to find me. I will settle him for you," declared Ravina in Gale. The prince did not reply when he heard this, merely smiling in response. "Even if he shamelessly brings out all the people he spoke of earlier, I'll receive any moves he'll send at me with. It just so happens that I'm also interested to experience for myself how good our number one unofficial Outer Mountain disciple is." Although his tone was calm, there was a faint mockery contained deep within it. The things Drake had done today had clearly already angered Ezra Zephyr. But the anger was deeply hidden, veiled by his smirk. Upon hearing that Ezra intended to cross swords with Drake, worry bubbled within Mahi as she hurriedly tried to caution him. "You shouldn't underestimate him. Drake is very strong, and has a tremendous amount of rallying power amongst the Shurian disciples. Relax, I will not underestimate anyone. Although Drake is strong, if he believes I'm a soft persimmon, I'm afraid that he will crack his teeth." The prince waved his hand, indicating he did not wish to speak any further on the topic. He then continued on his way along the mountain path. As she watched him leave, Mahi clenched her teeth as she mumbled, "Why are you trying to act cool at a time like this?" She then turned her head, looking towards the direction Drake had left in earlier as iciness flitted across her eyes. "Drake, if something happened to Ezra, you will know that my wrath is far more ferocious than Ravina's." Night enveloped the unofficial Outer Mountains. However, numerous figures were gathered in a certain little house. The most eye-catching amongst the group was a young man dressed in white, Drake. Drake sat in the center, the surrounding gazes containing a trace of respect when they looked towards him. As the undisputed number one amongst the Outer Mountain disciples, Drake commanded a tremendous amount of support and respect amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. There were currently dozens of disciples present, all of whom were first-class disciples, while also from the Shurian continent. They could be said to be the elites amongst this batch of Outer Mountain disciples, making them the strongest disciple faction in the Outer Mountains when gathered like this. In the face of their might, any of the other unofficial Outer Mountain groups could only give way. "It's rare for you to invite us over, Drake. There must be something you want to tell us today, right?" Paul Channa had a wide grin plastered across his face. He was likely the only one present who could address Drake in this manner. After all, although he was less talented than Drake, he was no slouch either. In addition, the Channa clan he came from was a powerful faction in the Shurian continent. "If there's anything we can do for Brother Drake, feel free to let us know." An intimidating young man smiled from the side. His name was Toria, and he was one of the more well-known figures amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, while also ranked 6th amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples. If one were to sweep one's gaze across the group at this moment, one would be surprised to see nearly half the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples present. The other disciples nodded and agreed in succession. Drake softly chuckled, reaching out a hand to call for silence. His gaze swept around the group as he said, "There is only a month before the peak selection ceremony." Everyone's expressions tensed a little, clearly understanding the importance of the ceremony. It was an event that would determine their future prospects in the spirit-devouring mountain. "I've heard that the one who takes first place will be rewarded by the sect. The ultimate winner will not only be given a gamma layer technique, but they have even made an exception this time and decided to also bestow the champion a single divine spirit ablution." Upon hearing Drake's words, the surroundings burst into noise, everyone's eyes now burning with desire. To think that it would be divine spirit ablution. Paul clicked his tongue in amazement. It's said that only Diamond Belt disciples get to enjoy such a thing. It is very precious and valuable indeed. Paul's words made the disciples that had yet to fully understand lick their lips in desire. Diamond Belt disciples. That was the highest rank in the Outer Mountains. But the first place will definitely end up with Brother Drake. Someone sighed. Although they coveted the first place reward, they were well aware of their worth. With Drake participating, none of them would be able to compete. Drake chuckled. Besides the first place, anyone who enters the top 10 will be able to directly become Gold Belt Outer Mountain disciples. If they become Diamond Belt disciples in the future, they will also get to taste the divine spirit ablution. The young man called Moria rubbed his chin and said, but the competition for the top 10 will be very intense. There are quite a few capable individuals in this batch of Outer Mountain disciples. Yeah, some of the riffraff other continents are pretty good, added in someone else. Drake said, I've gathered everyone here today for this very matter. His gaze swept across the crowd as he continued, the peak selection ceremony will be a fierce contest, hence, I intend to fix the top 10 spots to prevent any unnecessary fighting. Everyone looked at each other, evidently not understanding what he meant. What right did they have as disciples to fix the top 10 spots? Do we have the right to fix the top 10 spots? Asked an uncertain voice asked. Whoever has the heart or fist will have the right. Drake smiled faintly. We Shurian and Ryan disciples will take 8 of the top 10 spots. The other 2 will be thrown for the other continent disciples to fight over. The crowd's eyes brightened. If they could occupy 8 spots, it would undoubtedly be great news for them. However, 8 seemed to be a little too much. Moria could not help but ask, will the other continent disciples agree? One had no choice but to admit that there were more disciples from the other continents. Although they could not compare in quality, it would not be easy to convince so many of them to fight for just 2 spots. Drake smiled slightly and said, anyone who disagrees can come and find me. Brother Drake is so domineering. The others gave him a thumbs up, already unable to restrain their excitement. From the looks of it, Drake intended to forcibly occupy 8 spots for the Shurian and Ryan disciples, 4 for each. Since we have agreed, if anyone does not follow the rules during the peak selection ceremony, we'll just have to expel him or her. Drake's eyes narrowed slightly. The numerous disciples exchanged a look, before all of them said, everything shall be as Brother Drake says. He nodded, before he said in an uncaring manner, besides this, if the other continent disciples have any opinions, tell them that all of this started because of Ezra Zephyr. This was undoubtedly forcing the other continent disciples to grow resentful towards Ezra Zephyr. Only now were the many disciples struck by a flash of understanding. So Ezra Zephyr had offended Brother Drake. Don't worry, Brother Drake, that kid has been growing too big-headed recently. It is time to let him know exactly who calls the shots in the Outer Mountains. Drake chuckled as he gazed upon the group now filled with righteous indignation. He raised his head, his cold eyes looking towards a certain mountain creek far away. Ignorant mutt Ezra. Look at me, I only need to arrange a few things to make everyone your enemy. I heard that you intend to take one of the top 10 spots in the peak selection ceremony? Haha, since that is so, you will only be able to contest for those 2 spots. I hope that you will not drown in the saliva from everyone's cursing when that happens. As for the other 8, if you dare to touch them, there won't even be a need for me to take action. These Shurian and Ryan disciples will ensure you're beaten black and blue. Time galloped past like a white steed, swiftly passing into the Outer Mountains.